increase in civil legal aid fees since 1996.
Perhaps.
Conservatives left legal aid in a mess, like so many other things, so I welcome the sums that she's announcing. But can my honourable friend assure me that that money will reach Ealing, which we've never even had a CAB, not in the 10 years I've been MP, not in the 50 years I've been on this planet, to refer constituents to. So can she assure us that my constituents can get the access to justice they deserve too out of this?
I welcome her question. The Legal Aid Agency keeps contracts under review to ensure that there is provision right across the country, including in Ealing. And as I said earlier, the additional money going into legal support, which includes advice services such as citizens' advice bureaus, law centres and other advice providers, will reach constituents just like hers, both remotely and face-to-face.
We now come to topicals. Gregory Stafford.
Topical number 2, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The House will be aware of the attack at HMP Frankland on the 12th of April. The bravery of the officers involved that day undoubtedly saved lives. My thoughts are with them as they recover. I think also of the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing and their families who are understandably outraged. Since the attack, I have suspended access to kitchens in separation centres and in close supervision centres. Alongside that, an independent review will ascertain how this incident was able to happen, what more must be done to protect prison staff, and more widely, how separation centres are run. The prison service will also conduct a snap review of the use of protective body armour. And in addition, I can today announce that HMPPS will trial the use of tasers in our prisons. Wherever we can strengthen our defences to better protect our staff and the public, we will do so. And now, Mr Speaker, let me turn to the horrific attacks in Nottingham on the 13th of June 2023, which cost Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates their lives. I pay tribute to their families and the survivors, many of whom are in the public gallery today. The Prime Minister promised we would heed their calls for a public inquiry. I can today announce that a full statutory inquiry will take place. It will be chaired by Her Honour Deborah Taylor, and it will have the power to compel witnesses, and I will place its full terms of reference in the libraries of both houses at the earliest opportunity. Mr Speaker, this inquiry must be thorough in its assessment of the facts and unsparing in its recommendations. That is the very least that we owe to those who have lost so much and fought so hard for this moment. I am sure this House, so often divided, will be united on that at least today.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I associate myself with the comments made by the Lord Chancellor and sympathy to the families of those who were attacked. In my constituency in Borden, the release of a sex offender to the Hogmore, to property near the Hogmore enclosure, which is frequently used by young people, families and children, has caused consternation in the constituency. So can I ask the Lord Chancellor what she's doing to ensure that those people who have been convicted of sex offences are properly monitored when released into the community, and do national and local agencies have the resources and powers to make sure that these risks are monitored and the public are kept safe?
I thank the honourable member for his question. We do have robust processes in place to make sure, both at a national and a local level, that those offenders can be monitored effectively and that those monitoring mechanisms are as robust as possible. I shall happily look into the case that he raises and ensure he gets a ministerial response.
Adam Joe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Sorry, I'm still new, clearly. The Conservatives presided over 14 years of total failure in our justice system. Let me be topical. To restore justice in this country and to keep my constituents in Newcastle and Lyme safe, we can't just do more of the same, Mr Speaker. We need more transparency about the time criminals spend in jail, and common sense sentencing must mean exactly that. So how does the Minister think technology can help make that possible?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. I really have to caution members opposite against groaning. I appreciate they might not be proud of their record. I wouldn't be if that was the record I'd left behind after being in government. But I think groaning shows the contempt in which they held the public, who have had to suffer the consequences of a truly dire Conservative Party legacy. My honourable friend is right that technology can, and we hope will, provide better solutions to the management and the supervision of offenders in the community, and I look forward to the sentencing review's findings in this regard.
So, Secretary of State Robert Jeffrey.
Can I support my right honourable friend's decision to commission a full statutory inquiry into the terrible attack in Nottingham? I know that will be welcomed by the families, by everyone in the city and across my home county of Nottinghamshire. So I fully support my right honourable friend's welcome decision. Mr. Speaker, Greg O'Callaghan is a serving immigration judge who decides asylum and deportation appeals. It took nothing more than a basic Google search to uncover his past comments that the Conservative Party should be treated the same way as Nazis and cancer. As a sitting judge, he's publicly supported Labour's plans to scrap the Rwanda scheme and for illegal entry into the United Kingdom to be decriminalised. Does the Lord Chancellor believe this is compatible with judicial impartiality? And if not, what does she intend to do about it?
Well, firstly, let me thank the Right Honourable gentleman for the remarks he made in relation to the new Nottingham inquiry. I'm very grateful for his support. I'm sure the whole House will want to see that inquiry come to as quick a conclusion as possible. Let me say to him, when people might have complaints to make about judges, there is a placed mechanism for them to do so by making a complaint to the Judicial Complaints Office. If he wishes to make a complaint, he can do so. What I'm not going to do is indulge in personal, effectively doxing of judges, not when judges are simply doing their job of applying the law in the cases that appear before them. If there are complaints to be made about judicial conduct, I'm sure the Shadow Lord Chancellor knows how to go about doing it.
Can I just say we have to be careful on what we're doing, and we're not stepping into an area we should be. We're not meant to criticise judges, and this House wouldn't do so. And I'm sure we'd like to change the tone. Roy Jennings.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important that judges and the manner in which they are appointed is properly scrutinised in this House, and I won't shy away from that. Mr. Speaker, Helen Pitcher was forced to resign in disgrace as the chair of the Criminal Cases Review Commission after a formal panel found that she'd failed in her duties during one of the worst miscarriages of justice in recent memory. But she's still in charge of judicial appointments, despite judges appearing in the media every week now for their activism. Her commission has failed to conduct the most basic checks on potential judges, either out of sheer incompetence or out of sympathy with their hard-left open borders views. The commission is broken and is bringing the independence of the judiciary into disrepute. How much longer will it take for the Justice Secretary to act and to remove the chair of this commission from her position and defend the independence and reputation of the judiciary?
I'm afraid he can't elide the process for the appointment of judges with a wider attack on the independence of the judiciary. I would hope that he would take the admonishment from the Speaker and the clear approbation of this House to reflect on the way in which he is approaching his role. If there are complaints to be made about judicial conduct, there is already a robust process in place to do so, and if the Shadow Chancellor wants to avail himself of that, I'm sure, given how active he is, he'll be happy to do so. What is completely improper is to take his position in this House to indulge in a wider attack of the judiciary at a time when we know that judicial security has been compromised.
Order, please. It is topicals with other members to get in. It's a very... Tension's running high. Let's just see if we can calm them down with the integers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a recent visit to Featherstone Prison near Wolverhampton, I came across a number of recalled prisoners who were there for minor technical breaches of their probation, sometimes for up to a year. Can the Secretary of State please outline what data is collected on the reasons for prison recalls and how that data then informs policy decisions aimed at reducing unnecessary returns to custody?
Minister.
I'm happy to write to my honourable friend on the detail of the data collection and remind him that we've got a sentencing review in process that will be looking at all of these things.
A bit more.
Mr. Speaker, in a single week in Bradford, we've seen council leaders once again reject my calls for a full rape gangs inquiry. An ex-police officer threatened with arrest for investigating these horrific crimes, and now a judge blocking the release of official transcripts from a major rape gang trial in Bradford. So can the Lord Chancellor explain why our justice system is being used to block the truth about these trials?
Well, what I would say to the honourable gentleman is it's not appropriate in these difficult cases to misrepresent what the correct position is. The Home Secretary has already set out in this House and answered questions on our approach to the grooming gangs issue and the local inquiries. And on court transcripts, we are piloting AI technology for accuracy so that we can, in future, we hope, be able to produce transcripts. At the moment, the costs are prohibitive and the accuracy is not there with the technology that is available.
Dan Joseph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Restricted patients are mentally disordered offenders who are detained in hospitals for treatment and who are subject to special controls by the Justice Secretary. So can I ask my right honourable friend, what additional support is the department giving to help mental health trusts to treat, rehabilitate these patients so they can be released from this secure environment in a timely manner?
My honourable friend raises a serious and difficult question. The Mental Health Bill introduced to Parliament last November aims to stop restricted patients from languishing in hospital unnecessarily, whilst prioritising public protection and managing any risk. The Department also works closely with clinicians and care teams to make decisions on restricted patients as quickly as possible in line with the published guidelines.
Julie Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Release on temporary licence is denied for people who say nasty stuff on Twitter, but granted for much more serious crimes. Can the Secretary of State tell me when I can expect a satisfactory reply to an urgent Rossell case, one that I've already raised with the Prisons Minister and senior civil servants, that affects a grieving family in my constituency?
Well, I'll ensure that she gets that response as quickly as possible. I'll chase that up this afternoon. But she will know that release on temporary licence is a mechanism with governor supervision. If you follow the rules in prison, you become eligible. If you don't follow the rules, you are not eligible for release on temporary licence.
The Minister give an assessment of the potential merits of restricting triable either way offences to summary trial, except for sentencing.
Minister.
I thank him for his question. At a time when victims are waiting far too long for their day in court, it's right that we look at all options, and we've asked Sir Brian Leveson to consider all options in his review, including the reclassification of some offences to summary only.
Mr. Speaker, we should all be really concerned that the government have quietly abandoned their pledge to hold 5 local inquiries into grooming gangs, because the victims still need justice, the public still need answers, we still need a full inquiry. But in the meantime, can the Minister tell us what specific actions, not just references to AI, her department is taking to ensure full transparency and public confidence in the cases that do come to court?
Well, sentencing remarks are already available for some of those cases. We have a robust judicial system. It can handle difficult cases in front of it. If she's got a concern about transcripts, I've already dealt with that. The cost of full court transcripts is very prohibitive, which is why we're looking at technological solutions, AI in particular. We have a number of pilots running. The thing is to make sure that they are accurate so that the information that's put in the public domain actually reflects what was said and done in the courtroom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst the extra sitting days to reduce court delays announced by the Secretary of State to be welcome, does the Minister agree with me that the state of the court estate also needs some attention, as some courts are out of action due to disrepair issues?
He is absolutely right. I visited the Telford Justice Centre the other day, and one of the courtrooms was out of use because of mould and a leaky roof. This government is investing additional capital investment, an additional £20 million this year in maintaining our buildings and restoring them so that they can be full and active for use. But we're also investing in new court buildings, from Blackpool to the City of London. There are new courts, and they will serve the public well.
Paul Calder.
Mr. Speaker, the passing of Pope Francis was a profound loss. Throughout his life, he was a passionate advocate for a justice system that put reconciliation at its heart. With the publication of the Independent Sentencing Review expected imminently, will the government take this opportunity to move our justice system towards one that, in the words of Pope Francis, contains a horizon of hope and reintegration, and commit to restorative justice being placed at the heart of our justice system?
Well, I think restorative justice clearly does have a role to play, but the principles of our sentencing review are clear. There must always be a prison place available for people who are dangerous and need to be locked up, and we have to do more to help people turn their backs on a life of crime, and I hope that's something that people across this House will agree on.
Colin Naismith.
Thank you, Mr.
Speaker, compared to the same period in 2023, there have been 21% more foreign national offenders removed since July 2024, when this government came into office. So may I congratulate the Lord Chancellor on this achievement and ask what the new funding announced to speed this up will do to increase the numbers being removed.
We've already got off to a good start in terms of the deportation of foreign national offenders from our prisons. The new funding will enable more caseworkers to try and speed up the removal of even more FNOs. I'm very pleased that we've seen a higher number deported this year compared to the previous year when the Conservatives were in office.
Mr. Smart.
Mr. Speaker, a British mother in my constituency faces forced return to Poland to stay with her young children under the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of Child Abduction, having fled domestic abuse. With no knowledge of the local language and no source of income there, she risks either dependence on her abuser or homelessness. And this is because the Convention ignores the issue of domestic abuse, allowing it to be manipulated by abusers. Would ministers support my bill, the Hague Abduction Convention Domestic Abuse Bill, that I will present soon, that would change the implementation of the Hague Convention in UK domestic law to protect mothers from the threat of return in this way?
I would happily meet with the honourable member to discuss her bill and to tackle this issue head-on.
Nadia Whittam.
I thank my right honourable friend for the announcement that she's made today and thank the government for listening to bereaved families and surviving victims. It's only right that the inquiry is statutory to ensure that it has the power to compel witnesses and hold those responsible for failings to account. What assurances can she give that the inquiry conducted will be done in a timely manner and that the lessons it uncovers will be implemented swiftly to help ensure that similar attacks do not take place again?
I thank my honourable friend for her comments today and also for her support and for assiduously representing the needs of her constituents. The inquiry is going to be, as I said, chaired by Her Honour Deborah Taylor, who's a very experienced senior retired judge. I have every confidence in her and she is already going to be meeting the families of the victims and the survivors and she has undertaken to make sure that the inquiry works at pace and makes its findings as quickly as possible.
Davis.
Can I press the Secretary of State on this issue of transcripts? When I asked for a transcript for a major trial recently, Manchester Crown Court told me it cost me £100,000. When I pressed them, it went down to £9,000, but still way beyond the reach of most people. This is a travesty of justice. Other countries, including some American states, have free transcripts available now. When is she going to sort this out?
He will know that the issue is, at the moment, transcripts have to be physically transcribed by a human, listening back to what was said and done in court and transcribing it by hand. Previously, speech-to-text transcription has been piloted by the previous government. It wasn't accurate enough. I'm sure he'll agree that any transcripts that are ultimately published have to actually be accurate. It's why we're looking at AI models. We hope to be able to find a model that gives us the requisite level of accuracy and also the speed in order to be able to publish transcripts and to do so cheaply.
Mr. Speaker, children adopted from care or living under special guardianship are currently disproportionately at risk of entering the criminal justice system later in life if early trauma goes untreated. So, given the recent changes in the Adoption and Special Guardianship Fund, what steps is the Secretary of State or the Lord Chancellor taking, rather alongside Cabinet colleagues, to ensure that more equitable access to that kind of support is available?
Minister.
We know how vulnerable many children with care experiences are, and we're working closely with colleagues in the Department for Education to help reduce their risk of entering the criminal justice system. This government is committing £50 million to the Adoption and Special Guardianship Support Fund this year.
Sir Julian.
Will the Secretary of State take a special look at the problem of rogue builders who repeatedly target our constituents, often very vulnerable people, take thousands from them and wreck their homes, and yet the only redress is said to be trading standards? Surely this amounts to fraud, and surely there ought to be a crime and a prosecution to follow.
Minister.
If any crime is committed, or even being alleged to be committed, it should be reported to the police in the first instance. Victims have rights under the Victims Code. We've recently done a campaign to advertise the Victims Code to create awareness of this, and we will soon be consulting on the Victims Code so it reaches all victims of potential crime more broadly.
Chair of the Justice Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Lord Chancellor for establishing the inquiry into the Nottingham attacks? But freedom of information requests by the charity 100 Families disclosed last month that at least 392 mental health patients in England committed or were suspected of murder or manslaughter between 2018 and 2023. Those victims included Susan and Geoffrey Farrance, the elderly parents of my constituent. Will the inquiry consider cases like the Farrances so we can learn all lessons necessary to prevent these tragic and avoidable crimes?
Well, I thank the Chair of the Justice Select Committee. He's raised an important issue for his own constituents that also has wider significance. I will be publishing the full terms of reference and placing them in the libraries of both houses very, very soon. But regardless of whether it goes into the specifics of every other type of case, I'm sure that the review will make findings for how these sorts of cases, particularly for people with mental health conditions, are properly managed. And I'm sure that those findings will be of interest, not just to our department, but to others, and will be implemented by this government in due course.
Final question, Caroline Bowman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a case in my constituency of a young offender well below 16 who is causing havoc and has been arrested many, many times. He's not complying with a court order. And the assumption is against incarceration because of his age. Could the Minister explain what work the government is doing to crack down on prolific offending by young people who are well below 16, who are causing stress and fear in their local communities?
Minister.
I'm very happy to answer queries about that particular issue if she wishes to write to me. But what the government is doing is it's increased the youth offending team budget this year, and it's also continuing to invest in the turnaround programme, which, as I said before, has shown that young people who are engaged in the turnaround programme have only 5% chance of reoffending.
Right, that completes questions. We'll let the front bench change over. Right, let us come to the urgent question. Kevin Hollinrake.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question, which is to ask the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities, Local Government if she will make a statement on the disruption to waste collection and the deployment of the military in Birmingham.
Minister.
Thank you. Before I start, can I first of all start by recognising the significant contribution of Pope Francis on his passing, and also as the Minister for Local Government in England, can I wish everyone a happy St George's Day for tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, members across the House will be aware of the continuing disruption caused by industrial action in Birmingham. The Government has repeatedly called for Unite to call off the strikes and accept the fair deal that's on the table. The Commissioners and the Council are undertaking necessary reforms in the context of a challenging financial situation. The legacy of equal pay, where women workers were systematically paid less than their male counterparts for similar roles, and though of course the Council must chart that course themselves, our actions speak to our determination for the welfare of the citizens of Birmingham. We've been providing intensive support to the Council in its efforts to address the backlog of waste that has been building up on the city's streets, and significant progress has been made in the last fortnight. Through a concerted effort, and with the assistance of other councils, private operators, and the endeavour of many hundreds of determined workers who have worked extremely long hours, the result, 26,000 tonnes of excess waste have been removed, and the levels are now approaching normal. More than 100 bin trucks are out every day, and regular bin collections have resumed. The Council continues to monitor the situation closely to ensure that waste does not build up again. This is a government that stands up for working people. The industrial action is in no one's interest, because the deal on the table is a good deal. The Council has worked hard to offer routes to maintain pay through transferring workers to comparable roles, and in some cases, to upskill those workers in scope. There may be details to iron out, of course, but that's why talks are so important. But as we've made clear repeatedly, Unite should suspend the strike. they should accept the deal and they should bring this dispute to an end. The government will continue to be on the side of the people of Birmingham and to support the council into creating a sustainable, a fair and a reliable waste service that its residents deserve.
Kevin Holleray, Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is astounding that the Secretary of State, having had to resort to calling in the army to cover her blushes for her failure to resolve this situation, was not intending to make an oral statement to the House and had to be dragged before it by means of this urgent question. For she is failing, Mr. Speaker, failing to stand up to the unions, failing to protect the residents of the UK's second city, failing to protect the reputation of our nation, and now resorting to being bailed out by our brave armed forces, which I note the Minister did not even mention. It is a national embarrassment, Mr. Speaker. Now, I realise the Minister and the Secretary of State were not born until 1980, but many in this House and in the wider country remember the 1970s very well, the winter of discontent. It is clear with this government we risk going back to those days. To prevent that from happening, I offer him and the Secretary of State our support if the Minister will clarify and confirm what is the projected cost to the taxpayer for the involvement of the military. Will he rule out the humiliation of service personnel ever having to collect refuse? And will he commit to using the provisions of the Minimum Service Level Act to ensure residents receive a basic level of service, to reinstate the legislation that would allow the Council to commission agency workers to clean up the city until the strike is resolved, and finally to abandon the provisions in the Employment Rights Bill that give unions access to every single workplace in this country, that lower the threshold for union recognition and make it much easier for unions to call strikes. Doing this now, and he will have our support. But if he and she ducks the tough decisions to please her union paymasters, the tail, Mr. Speaker, may once again wag the dog in this country, which could take it back to the 1970s.
Minister.
Yeah. Well, if that's a dog, it's more like a Bichon Frise attack on the government, I'm afraid. It really did not land, because what do people in Birmingham want? In the context of a situation that is not acceptable, where rubbish was accumulating, the people of Birmingham want it to be resolved. And what they have in this government is a government that doesn't play party politics. We don't play council round in the way that the previous government did. What we do is to work together in partnership for the end that's important. And while they've been carping from the sidelines, they've been doing this for weeks now, they've not had a single solution. But they've had every single criticism, not a single solution. You'd be forgiven to believe you've not even been in power for 14 years when Birmingham was sent to the wall. Now, let me just pick up the MOD. Of course, we are appreciative of our colleagues in the MOD for the support that they have offered. And the 3 logistics advisors had made a difference. But they themselves have said that Birmingham is more than capable of making sure that the rounds are collected and the trucks are on the road as of this week, because that mutual support is important. But I need to pull him up on a comment that he made here. When he talks about the humiliation of collecting waste from the streets, the humiliation of decent working class people going out to provide a public service to millions of people across England is not a humiliation. It's a public service. It's one that is critical to our nation's interests. And to say that it's a job of humiliation, I would say that working class people, the bin collectors across this country, take pride in their work and they deserve more respect from the bloody opposition.
Yeah. Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Session-Lomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I associate myself with the remarks by the Minister on the passing of Pope Francis. May his perfect soul rest in peace. Mr. Speaker, it's important for us to remember the innocent residents who were caught up in this dispute and the fact that they've been suffering for many weeks without that refuse being collected. I think about the many families who had to celebrate Eid and seeing all that rubbish continue to pile up. In just over 4 weeks, there'll be another half term where, again, we'll have many families at home. So it's really important that the government continue to work closely with Birmingham and all parties to make sure this is resolved. The Minister outlined some of the concerns around the funding pressures that councils of all political parties have faced over the last few years. And he will know that he's handed out, and the government have handed out, exceptional financial support for a number of councils who continue to face challenges with their finances. Can the Minister assure the House that in the discussions with Birmingham and others that will continue to support hard-working local government officers and making sure that their finances are back in a proper and fit manner way so that we are not facing situations like what we are seeing happening in Birmingham?
Minister.
Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for that question? And in a way, it really hits at the heart of the fragile situation that we inherited as a government, which is after 14 years, Birmingham, and in fact many councils of all political stripes, have been sent to the wall by the previous government. And that was a testament, if you like, to the number of bankruptcy notices that were issued before. Now, what we've been able to do is to stabilise the sector through the recovery grant, the first time ever that the recovery grant was issued, and Birmingham was the largest beneficiary of that. So we have given that city the support that it needs, but of course we want to make sure that the progress that we've seen over the last couple of weeks is maintained. And what I will say, and of course I appreciate completely the unacceptable scenes where waste was being built up on people's streets. It was not okay in normal time, but it certainly was not okay in half term, when children were playing in their local parks and on their streets, which is why we moved quickly to make sure that that waste was removed. And the very fact now that 26,000 tonnes has been removed just shows the dedication of those frontline workers.
Nicosia, the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I refer you to my declarations of interest? It's unacceptable that this dispute has dragged into a ninth week, and even more disgraceful that the people of Birmingham are now forced to clean up their own streets. But to those who gave up their Easter holidays to pick up rubbish for their neighbours, thank you. But let's be honest, you should never have had to do it. This goes way beyond Birmingham. It started with an equal pay claim that bankrupted the council, and so with widespread local government reorganisation ahead of us all, what is to stop it from happening again? As councils merge, staff will sit side by side doing the same job but on completely different pay from their colleagues. It's unjust, unsustainable and it's a ticking time bomb. At BCP Council, where I was leader, 6 years after the reorganisation, pay harmonisation is still going on. We couldn't afford to meet everyone's expectations, and neither can most councils as they teeter on the edge. So what is the Minister doing to stop this from spiralling elsewhere and protecting residents from eye-watering tax hikes or devastating service cuts?
Well, I'm going to be careful not to stray too far from Birmingham, which is not affected by local government reorganisation, but to say that it's completely usual when looking at the transfer of the workforce that negotiations with the workers and trade unions take place to harmonise terms and conditions and pay. And so that will take place in the usual way, and we need to be careful that we don't set hairs running unnecessarily. Now, the issue in Birmingham, in a way the foundational issue, is the issue of equal pay. And for far too long, and this is the heart of the issue, for far too long, women workers were paid far less than their male counterpart for the same comparable roles, and that went on for decades. And what that council has to face, in the way that other councils faced many years earlier, is that has to be resolved. You know, it cannot continue that women are being paid less than their male counterparts, and this, in the end, is about having that harmonisation in the right way.
Corgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for his support in addressing the public health concerns in Birmingham. And as he said, 26,000 tonnes of waste has now been cleared and weekly collections will resume. I want to put on record my thanks to everyone involved in the clean-up, including many volunteers. They are the best of Birmingham. Does the Minister agree it is right that the Council resolves equal pay issues, as over 7,000 women are due compensation now, and that is precisely what the deal on offer does, while ensuring that no worker has to lose pay?
And that's precisely the issue here with the worker role that really started the strike action to begin with, that there was an enhanced payment made for that role that did not stand when it went through job evaluation when compared to women who were doing similar roles elsewhere in the council. And that can't stand. And there can be nothing in this agreement, and where there has to be a red line, is that there can be nothing reached by way of an agreement that compromises the council position on equal pay that builds up a liability for the future. But I absolutely pay tribute to the community groups and to the frontline workers that have made sure that the response to the clean-up has been one of cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister make a point of thanking the well-run and cost-effective Conservative councils that have either helped or offered to help clear out this terrible mess? And will he bear in mind that it's not just the bin strike which my poor long-suffering constituents in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield have had to suffer. It's also the pending closure of our libraries and the massive hike in council tax. And does he understand why so many of us want to see a proper judge-led inquiry into how bankrupt Birmingham has got Britain's second city into this mess? And will he also bear in mind that this is a dispute between two wings of the Labour Party? And whatever I may think of the council that he leads, it is quite wrong that my constituent, the leader of the council, should have had a photograph of his house put on social media by Unite. And will he condemn that action by Unite?
Well, I mean, I'll be clear, because what I saw over the last few weeks were union officials who were having photographs of their house, and I saw the same trade union using photographs of the council leader's house and the cabinet member's house, and neither of those are okay. This is a fraught dispute already. It requires good faith of all parties, and it requires negotiation and to be in the same room and be able to talk through the issues in the interest of the workers and the people of the City of Birmingham. And our hope and expectation is that whatever has happened, a line is drawn, and that they move forward in good faith.
Sorry, Alan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer attention to the Register of Members' Interest. The crisis over bin collections in Birmingham has dragged on for far too long, and my constituents have suffered significantly as a result. Whilst I understand the financial pressures on the council, clearly it is unreasonable to expect any worker to accept a pay cut. Will the Minister commit to taking all steps possible to encourage good faith negotiations between both parties, and that a fair deal can be reached so that this vital service can be restored without any further disruption?
So, I mean, in terms of equal pay, I don't think there's been a single example, although I'm prepared to be corrected, where equal pay hasn't, in all cases, had on the edges winners and losers. That is the element of equal pay that we have to accept in the end. The envelope is not unlimited, and so the books do have to balance. But on the pay, the issue of the work or role and how that's being changed and whether workers need to lose pay or not, the council is offering a sideways move to street scene on the same grade 3, which will mean no loss of income. They're offering workers a move to this, an equivalent grade 3 role. Even if training is required, they will provide that training. And they're also offering an upgrade to LGV driver training, so that currently loaders can upgrade to being a driver, which of course carries a higher payment than their current role.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I recall asking the Minister on a previous occasion about getting support from military personnel, and the Minister at that point said that I'd taken my point from 0 to 100 very quickly. The difficulty with this government is that they've been very slow to react. I was out last week Thursday with a local organisation picking up bin bags with youth workers that had been working 12-hour shifts during the morning and then spending the evening cleaning up the streets. What the Minister's failed to raise in this chamber is that there are thousands and thousands of tonnes of recyclable waste which is not being collected, encouraging further fly tipping. Yeah. So when will this government intervene, resolve the issue? The bin workers work hard, and there's up to 200 which will lose up to £8,000, and that needs to be resolved.
Well, I mean, I share his appreciation of community volunteers who are cleaning up the streets, as much as I welcome the hard work of hundreds of frontline council workers who have stepped in to make sure that the accumulated waste can be clear, and their efforts have meant that 26,000 tonnes of accumulated waste has now been cleared. And so we can share that at least. But on the question of when the government is appropriate to come in and offer support, well, that's when the major incident is called. And from that moment, he will know that I've been in Birmingham every week since then, that there have been daily update calls taking place with the council, and we've been providing central support to the council to clear up the city.
Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the efforts that he has made to keep Birmingham MPs informed on a cross-party basis during this dispute. I would also like to associate myself with the condemnations made in this place of the publication of photographs of the houses of some of the parties who are members of the dispute. My residents in Birmingham Northfield want to see a service that is not the same as before the strike. It must be better, and I hope that the Minister, I know, shares that ambition. But given we've heard today about the 1970s, it is not so long ago that a Conservative Secretary of State stood at this dispatch box and said that he was delighted to announce 12% cuts for Birmingham's budget, the sharpest of any unitary authority. Does he agree that the one word missing from the Shadow Secretary of State's question was sorry?
Well, I mean, we've been here repeatedly, really, questions and statements, and even oral questions that have been asked in the House, and not on a single occasion has the Shadow Secretary of State or even Shadow Ministers accepted their role in government for 14 years that have driven councils of all colours to the wall. We need to bear in mind that commissioners were brought in under the previous government, that Birmingham had to declare bankruptcy under the previous government. The only difference now is that they have a government on side willing to meet them financially, and that's why the recovery grant was so important, but also to meet them in spirit and through our actions, which is why we're working in partnership to clean up the streets and to get Birmingham clean.
Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Which legacy is the Minister most proud of? Rubbish and rats in Birmingham, or Labour's breach of its promise to the electorate to freeze council tax?
Yeah. I'm sure that sounded a better question when it was being drafted this morning. But in terms of the substance, I don't think anyone takes pride in the strike action and the waste that was accumulated on the street. This is a very serious issue. It's not acceptable at all that a major incident had to be called and that the public health concerns were as prevalent as they were, which is why we took quick action. It's why the streets have been cleaned to the tune of 26,000 tonnes. It's why there are more daily collections taking place now in terms of tonnage than there were in routine time, to make sure that they catch up and don't slip back. But we recognise, of course, that in the end, the only solution to this is to deal with the underlying strike action that is causing that disruption.
John MacDonald.
I refer to my register of interest. I'm a member of Unite. In fact, I'm very proud of it. I think there's 4 generations of my family that have been. Can I say to the Minister that not to rise to the provocations opposite? There's a difference between having 3 military advisers than having troops on the streets, which would be seen as an act of provocation and worsening the situation. Can I suggest to him instead that either the Secretary of State or he now convene the meetings between the Council and the Union to secure progress in the negotiations?
Well, of course, in terms of communication, there has been almost daily communication with the Council. The trade unions, of course, have made representations too. But we do need to be really clear here about appropriate roles and responsibilities and where lines of accountability are. The government is not the employer of the workforce in Birmingham. The Council is the employer of the workforce in Birmingham. And it's for the employer and the employees to reach an agreement that both can accept. Of course, we urge both parties to negotiate in good faith. We believe that the deal on the table is a good deal. And I think it's correct to say, of course, workers have the right to make their representations known. In the end, though, the Council has to take into account all of its workforce, including over 7,000 women who historically were paid far less for equivalent roles than their male counterparts. And that's a foundational issue at the heart of this.
Mr. Speaker, despite assurances from the dispatch box before the Easter recess, we continue to see piles of rubbish on the streets in Birmingham. We continue to see the costs mounting, and the rats, the squeaky blinders, do continue to roam freely in the streets of Britain's second city. So I'd like to ask the Minister again, what is his government and the Labour-run Birmingham City Council doing to bring an end to the strike? Because enough is enough. Residents want to see an end to this.
So there's still work taking place. I mean, in terms of, I should address actually the issue of rodents, because that is a serious issue. Nobody wants to see rats around the street, particularly around the accumulated waste that was taking place. Which is why we welcome the Council's decision to suspend the call-out for pest control to make sure that households, when they do report rodents, aren't disadvantaged or have to have the financial impact of that. So we welcome that move in terms of the substance of the question. In terms of the response to this, we say from day one that the accumulated waste was not acceptable and it was a public health hazard. which is why the government stepped in to support the council to make sure that we could get more trucks out of the depot, that the amount of waste being collected could increase, and the amount of routine collections could be regularised. And I'm pleased to say that progress has been made. But of course, the thing that will ultimately resolve this is for the trade unions and the council to reach an agreement that brings the strike action to an end.
On promotion of Leeds United, Richard Burton.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I take that as a congratulation from the Speaker of the House of Commons at the promotion of Leeds United, so thank you very much. That's the most popular thing I've said in here for some time, which is saying something. I'm a Unite member, a trade union member, proud to be so. I remember the 2009 Leeds bin strike when the Conservative and Lib Dem run council tried to cut the bin workers' pay by £9,000, by up to £6,000, sorry. A 3-month strike followed, which was ultimately successful. I just want to raise the general point with the Minister when I hear much of what's been said in the Chamber. It's always wrong to castigate trade unions, an important part of our civil democracy, as the enemy within. And when we're talking about the Unite the Union and the strike, or any strike, it's not union officials that call the strike, it's trade union members. So Unite the Union means the bin workers. And it's really important that we don't allow trade unions and trade unionism to be demonised in relation to this dispute or any other.
I mean, what we can certainly agree on is that people, of course, have the right to strike, but people also have the right to go to work. And what we saw were the restriction of the number of bin trucks that could leave the depot. That had a significant impact on the amount of waste that could be collected. And the direct result of that was the accumulation of tens of thousands of waste on the street. What we really want, in the end, is for Unite, as the negotiating body of the workforce that it represents, and Birmingham City Council as the employer, to get around the table on the deal that has been tabled and to iron out the differences, if there are differences, to reach an agreement. And in the meantime, if that's going to take longer, we strongly encourage Unite to suspend strike actions during those negotiations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Birmingham City Council is the largest local authority in the UK by population, and for sadly many years it has been struggling with very severe problems that have been impacting on its residents. The government is engaged in local government reorganisation over much of the country. There's large parts of Birmingham City Council would maybe be better administered elsewhere out of the current City of Birmingham boundaries. Would the Minister look at actually whether it's time to review the boundaries of Birmingham City Council to see if it's just got to the stage where it's so large that it cannot function properly for its residents?
Well, I don't think anyone could criticise my work ethic, but I think reorganising a third of England and 20 million residents being affected is quite a reorganisation to deliver, and we should focus on that. There is no intention, as it stands, to reorganise Birmingham, but there is absolutely an intention to resolve the underlying trade union dispute that's taking place, to get people back to work, and to reach an agreement that is acceptable.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I just point out that this strike did start under this Labour government, under a Labour council, and continues, despite all his hand-wringing and anguish, under a Labour government, under a Labour council, and it really is futile for the government to try and pretend it's all somebody else's fault, least of all the previous government. And can he avoid also misrepresenting what my right honourable friend said? He made a perfectly reasonable suggestion that he should reinstate the legislation that would allow agency workers to be brought in to pick up the rubbish off Birmingham streets. Why won't he do that? Because he's pussyfooting around, kowtowing to his Labour paymasters, the trade unions.
Well, I mean, that's certainly the award for the silliest question yet. There is no kowtowing, there is no bowing. We played this with an absolutely straight bat in the interest of the people of Birmingham, in the way that the people of Birmingham would expect. When it comes to the issue of agency workers, our judgment is that that isn't required because the mutual aid that's been brought in from neighbouring councils and housing associations and the redeployment of frontline staff from elsewhere in the council has dealt with the accumulated waste that has been developing over that period, and we've now seen that 26,000 tonnes of waste cleared. And as I said before, now that trucks are leaving the depot as usual in most cases, there are now more collections taking place in terms of tonnage a day than in regular time. So the council is on top of that, and there isn't the need in the way that he speaks to bring in additional agency staff above and beyond.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Given that the Minister no doubt sincerely believes that the offer on the table is a good one, why does he think the unions are not accepting it?
Well, I mean, it's clear through the negotiations that there are a number of moving parts, and I should also be clear that we are not replicating those negotiations in this chamber. Those negotiations should take place between the employer and the employees and the trade unions, and we shouldn't be trying to circumnavigate that here. But our belief is it's an agreement that strikes the right balance between giving support to the workers in scope who are affected, so the worko roles that are in scope, but not undermining the equal pay work that's been done, that for far too long has seen women underpaid for the work that they've been doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister failed to answer my honourable friend's question on whether troops would be used to clear up the mess. Would he now do so? And with the Defence Secretary sitting next to him, who will know very well that a trained soldier's salary starts at around £25,000, will he say that in the event that troops are used, that they will also receive, as part of the MACA arrangements, arduous duty payments?
Well, as I said before, and I do think I've covered this at least a couple of times in the contribution, we are grateful to our colleagues in the MOD for the logistical support that they have provided. It was 3 members of staff on logistical planning, and they've had a significant impact, and the council are grateful to that, and we are grateful to that. What there isn't a requirement for are for troops to be deployed on the street to collect waste, because the council is getting on top of it. Now, we don't take that for granted, and we don't want any disruption to that. But to be clear, the military are not needed on the streets of Birmingham. The council have it in hand, and workers are doing that work today.
Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Genuine question to the Minister. I am a little bit confused as to what these 3 supermen and women from the MOD or the military have done, because one of the principles of mutual aid, military aid to the civil authority is that the people you're helping have not to have the capacity themselves, and it's unreasonable to expect them to grow it in a timely manner. So what have they done that Birmingham City Council couldn't do themselves?
I'm usually a bit suspicious when somebody starts off the question with this is a genuine question, but actually that was a proper question. Members could learn from that. In terms of the underlying question as to the added value that the MOD, calm down. The added value the MOD were able to provide were essentially any council has an organised routine and rotas for getting the bins collected in a given place. In Birmingham's situation, where they had mutual aid offers from other councils, they had to work out how best to deploy quite different offers of support in terms of trucks and available workers across the city in a different way. So the logistical workers from the MOD were supporting the creation of those new collection rounds as part of the response to clear the accumulated waste.
David Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister, or the Pied Piper as he's quickly becoming known as, clear up the record, please? In his opening statement, he said that the military offered their support to come and clear up this mess. Did they offer, or were they ordered by his department to come and support, because his government can't stand up to the unions?
So to answer I've covered already the value that the MOD have provided, and of course we work in partnership on that. The offer of support was made, it was given to the council. They have received that gratefully, but the MOD have also been very clear with the logistical planners they've had who have been on the ground in Birmingham, that the council is at the point now where it doesn't need the support from those logistical planners because it has the collection rounds in place, which I hope he would welcome.
Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer members to my register of interest. Just 8 weeks ago, the Minister for Local Government told me on the Select Committee there is a lot of good work taking place in Birmingham. The government wants to create super councils covering 500,000 people over vast areas to manage bin collections and other vital services, against the wishes of my constituents in Broxbourne. We've seen the result of this in Birmingham. So does the Minister believe that tons of rubbish on the streets is the model the rest of the country should follow?
But in a way, that shows the misunderstanding of why Birmingham is in the situation it is. It makes no more sense to say that Birmingham's problems are because of its size and scale than it would to say, well, look at the debt liabilities that are built up by some of the smallest councils in the country and the way that they've been borrowing many hundreds or thousands of times their revenue. These are, in a way, down to long-term issues. Some of it is the foundational funding that that council has been given in Birmingham. But in the end, Birmingham is getting its house in order. It's not an easy process, and they would say themselves they've got a way to go. But when it comes to resolving the historic equal pay liabilities, when it comes to resolving the Oracle IT system, there's a significant financial liability to the council. When it comes to modernising its workforce and that future operating model, the council is making progress, but it's got some way to go.
That now allows us to come to Jim Shannon.
Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers to those very difficult questions. The Minister will understand and know, of course, the absolute necessity of military intervention in civil life in Northern Ireland over a great many years. Whilst it is never an easy option, does the Minister not agree that if it is the only option, if a pay deal can be reached to ensure that disease does not spread through the city, that action has to be taken before the ill and the vulnerable pay the price of the standoff?
Well, I mean, as it stands, the situation for most streets at most times has returned to normal service. The accumulated waste that was building up, that was not acceptable at all, has been removed, and there's 26,000 tonnes of that has been removed. In most places, at most times, the routine collections of the bins are taking place as normal, and over 100 trucks a day are leaving the depots as usual. And so we hope that we don't return to the scenes that he talks about for the very reasons that he expresses. It's not acceptable from a public health point of view, and it has consequences.
That completes the urgent question. Let the front bench change over. The Defence Secretary's statement. Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, HMS Prince of Wales set sail from Portsmouth, and I trust the whole House will join me in wishing the entire Carrier Strike Group a safe and successful global deployment. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the ongoing war in Ukraine. Today, Parliament returns from our Easter break, but during the last 2 weeks, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine has continued. Drone strikes, missile attacks, fierce fighting on the front line. On Palm Sunday, men, women and children in Sumy, on their way to church, were hit by Putin's deadliest attack on Ukrainian civilians so far this year, killing 35 people, including young children, and injuring over 100 more. We're united in condemnation of this brutal attack and of Putin's illegal actions. At this critical moment for Ukraine and for European security, we have stepped up the government's efforts for Ukraine, and we will step up further, both to increase military support for the fight today and to secure peace for tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, we cannot jeopardise the peace by forgetting about the war. So 10 days ago in Brussels, the UK convened and I co-chaired the 27th meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, alongside my good friend, the German Defence Minister, Boris Pistorius. 51 nations and partners from Europe, from the Indo-Pacific, from South America, came together at NATO headquarters, with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, the US Defence Secretary Hegseth, and the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. We came together to step up support for Ukraine in the fight. Together we pledged a record 21 billion euros of military support to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position and to increase pressure on Putin to negotiate. Mr. Speaker, this year the UK is providing £4.5 billion of military support to Ukraine, more than ever before. And in Brussels, I announced 200 million of this support will be surged to the front line, with supplies starting to reach Ukraine's fighters within this month, including radar systems, anti-tank mines, and hundreds of thousands of drones. I also announced £160 million worth to help repair and maintenance of essential battlefield vehicles and equipment. This support will strengthen Ukrainian troops in the close fight now. It will also strengthen our industrial links with Ukraine and boost UK businesses. When President Trump talks about peace through strength, it is the commitments made through the Ukraine Contact Group that provide the strength to secure that peace. And despite President Putin's promise of a 30-hour pause in fighting, I can confirm that Defence Intelligence have found, and I quote, no indication that a ceasefire on the front line was observed over the Easter period. And 10,000 missiles and drones have been fired into Ukraine during this year alone, including from the Black Sea. So while Putin has said he declared an Easter truce, he broke it. While Putin says he wants peace, he's rejected a full ceasefire. And while Putin says he wants to put an end to the fighting, he continues to play for time in the negotiations. And the Russian military continue to pressure Ukraine on a number of fronts. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm Russian military progress is slowing. Putin gained less territory in March than he did in February, less territory in February than he did in January. Ukrainian towns, which Russia has been targeting since before Christmas, have still not been captured. Ukrainian troops have still not been ejected from Russian territory in Kursk. Whatever ground Putin is taking comes at a huge human cost. Over 940,000 Russians have likely been killed or injured in the war so far, including 150,000 killed or injured this year alone. Last month, the average daily casualty rate on the Russian side was 1,300, almost double the rate of this time last year. While at home, Putin faces crippling interest rates at 21%, inflation running at over 10%, and the Russian government spending nearly 40% of its entire budget on this military campaign. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, in the days ahead, it is, however, likely that Russia will keep up attacks on the Sumy Oblast to help it reclaim nearby contested areas of Kursk. In central Donetsk Oblast, Russia is targeting urban strongholds such as Teresk, Pavlovsk and Chaziv Yar. And in Kharkiv, Russia is continuing to make assaults towards the rail and logistics hub of Kupiansk. We do expect more ground to be taken, more Russian missiles to be fired into Ukraine. And that is why we must remain united for Ukraine, across this House, across this country, and across those nations standing alongside Ukraine. And we must step up support for Ukraine and pressure on Putin to force him to recognise that now is the time for peace, and continuing the war will prove much worse in the long run for Russia. Mr. Speaker, we believe peace is possible, and we must be ready for when that peace comes. So along with the vital military aid, the UK government continues this push for peace. The Foreign Secretary joined ceasefire discussions with the US, France and Germany and Ukraine in Paris last week, and in Brussels 10 days ago, along with my good friend the French Minister Sébastien Lecornu, I also convened and co-chaired the first Defence Ministers meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. 30 countries coming together to build on the hard work of over 200 military planners from Europe and beyond. That operational planning must remain classified, but I can assure the House these plans are real, they're substantial, they're well developed. Our reassurance force will have clear objectives for Ukraine. First, to secure safe skies. Second, to secure safe seas. Third, to support peace on the land. And fourth, to support the Ukrainian armed forces to become their own strongest possible deterrent against future Russian attacks. And in the days ahead, this detailed planning continues domain by domain, and nations will continue to provide firm commitments for this coalition. I will be also meeting tomorrow the Ukrainian Defence Minister Umarov and other allies as the government brings together the US, the UK and European ministers and national defence security advisors to discuss next steps, including what a ceasefire might look like and how to secure peace in the long term. Mr. Speaker, this war was never just about the fate of one nation. It's about not allowing national borders to be redrawn by force. It's about preventing aggressors across the world from being emboldened to threaten the security of all nations. And that's why the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. It's why UK leadership is playing a unique role to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position on the battlefield and in negotiations. And also to prepare building blocks for a lasting peace that will safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty and deter Putin from future aggression. Mr. Speaker, I hope this House today will join in sending a signal to President Putin and in saying to Ukraine, we will stand with you in the fight and we will stand with you in the peace whenever that may come.
Got the Secretary of State, James Carr.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate the opposition with the Secretary of State in wishing a good and successful mission to the crew of HMS Prince of Wales as it set sail on its latest trip. And I am grateful to the Secretary of State both for the advanced side of his statement and, as we did when we were in opposition, the support provided by his department for my recent visit to Ukraine. Indeed, it was a privilege to pay tribute to the victims of this terrible war at the Wall of Memory in Kyiv, but also a powerful reminder of the stark contrast between the reality on the ground of continued casualties and the lies and propaganda from the Kremlin in terms of any so-called ceasefire. It must be clear that to Putin, a ceasefire is simply part of a game, one that he has no intention of pausing. And we must continue to stand with all our allies in being 100% clear on who the aggressor is in this war. Those who pay the price for Putin's game are innocent civilians, such as those killed in the terrible strike on Sumy on Palm Sunday. Is the Secretary of State able to shed any light on reports that Russian forces used a cluster munition as part of this attack on civilians? And if so, would this not illustrate the extraordinary contrast between claims of ceasefires on the one hand and the reality of continued Russian indiscriminate bombing? In the face of such aggression, we remain proud of the extraordinary role the United Kingdom has played in backing Ukraine's struggle under successive governments, and I welcome the continued support announced at the new DCG. Turning to Secretary of State's latest update on the coalition of the willing. Whilst we will always stand with the government in supporting Ukraine, he knows that it would be a major shift to go from indirect provision of munitions to boots on the ground. Therefore, as the opposition, we are duty-bound to probe what remains several unanswered but very significant practical questions that any such deployment would entail. A month ago, on the 22nd of March, I wrote to the Secretary of State with a series of questions on the coalition of the willing. I have yet to receive a reply. So given the importance of those questions, I ask him them now. First, what progress has he made on securing a US military backstop? Secondly, what would be the expected rules of engagement? Thirdly, how many nations have definitively committed to sending troops? And fourthly, will he consider derogating from the ECHR for any deployment, given our military's previous experience of vexatious lawsuits arising from overseas operations? Of course, an extraordinary aspect of the coalition of the willing is that we are meant to be leading with France, whilst at the same time, behind our back, they are seeking to undermine our fishing rights in our own sovereign waters over access to a European defence fund that will definitively include non-EU nations. Now, when I pointed this out to orals last month, the Secretary of State asked me to drop the Brexit rhetoric. Yet over Easter recess, it was he who blasted the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, Kaja Kallas, when she suggested that his plan for troops in Ukraine was unclear. So what is clear? Almost alone, we stood by Ukraine from the very beginning of the war, helping them avoid an early capitulation that would have been a disaster for the whole of Europe.
We also offer our nuclear deterrent to European NATO 24/7, not to get better fishing rights, but to defend the freedom of European nations. A country that does all this should not be excluded from a defence fund that will include non-EU states and should not face punitive measures against its fishing fleet when we are meant to be doing everything possible to strengthen European defence solidarity. The Secretary of State needs to understand this is not about Brexit, this is not about Britain or France, this is about the security of the whole of Europe. Does he understand that, and can he confirm categorically that the government will not offer any concessions on fishing rights in order to secure an EU defence pact? Finally, Mr Speaker, turning to procurement for our own armed forces, both in Kyiv and this morning with cross-party colleagues in Parliament, I had the pleasure to meet Ukrainian manufacturers of drones that have been highly effective on the front line. So can I ask if the Secretary of State will support such companies in partnering with British companies to set up operations in the UK, both to boost Ukraine and give our military rapid access to proven capabilities? And given how much of this rests on the SDR, will it be published this month?
Mr Speaker, I'm glad the honourable gentleman has been to Ukraine recently. I'm glad we were able to facilitate that visit. I'm proud of the number of members of this House from all sides that are regularly going to Ukraine. It has a big impact on Ukrainian population that don't necessarily hear our debates in the UK, but when they see British parliamentarians from all sides, and yourself, Mr Speaker, as the Speaker of this House in Ukraine, they know that this is a country that stands united and stands with them. The honourable gentleman is completely right to draw what he calls the contrast between Putin's claims of a ceasefire and the reality of continued brutal attacks, including on civilian population in Ukraine. Mr Speaker, he asks about the potential situation of a negotiated peace in which we, alongside 30 other nations, as part of the coalition of the willing, are considering how best we can help secure that as a lasting peace, which is what President Trump has promised to deliver. He will have heard the Prime Minister say, we are, if necessary, fully committed to putting British troops on the ground if necessary. And we do that because the security of the UK starts in Ukraine. He asked about the US. And both I and the Prime Minister in our discussions with the US have been clear that Ukraine, post a negotiated ceasefire and peace, will need long-term security assurances, and that there is a role for the US to play in those. On the ECHR, look, it's long-standing practice, Mr Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows better than anyone, of successive governments, that the UK deployments, home and abroad, will always comply with international law. That's what sets us apart from nations like Putin's Russia. And I'm not going to be drawn into any of the operational deployment and what that may look like, because the only person who benefits from that, Mr Speaker, is President Putin. Two other things he raised with me. The High Representative for the EU, Kaja Kallas, and the question of a European Union-UK defence agreement and access to the sort of EU programmes that they are stepping up and putting in place. He quite rightly says, we have a part to play, we have a contribution to make, and let me reflect what Kaja Kallas herself has said. She says, I think the UK is a very important defence and security partner. It is the most logical defence and security partner that we have, and it is a beneficial relationship to both sides. It's why she and we are committed to negotiating a defence and security agreement. And finally, on the question of drones, he is right to point to the significance of drones in this current battle. It is now the fact that more casualties on both sides are caused by drones than artillery. And in terms of the UK-Ukrainian link, we have helped manufacture, supply in this country and in Ukraine over 14,000 drones since July in the last election. This is central to the Ukrainian defence strategy. It's central to the future of our own forces and it's central to... And the SDR, Mr. Speaker, we've said many times, it's close to completion, it's being finalised, and it will be published in the spring.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamanji Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While it was saddening to hear about the continued colossal death and destruction in Ukraine, I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and indeed his leadership of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which by pledging a record 21 billion euros has demonstrated that the 51 allies are firmly committed to helping our Ukrainian friends in their hour of need. The Secretary of State also alluded to the many shorter ceasefires that were agreed and then broken, and that the question we need to ask ourselves is, when President Putin says he wants a ceasefire, is that actually the case? But Secretary of State, if a much-needed ceasefire is agreed, how confident is he of convening and then keeping the coalition of the willing together?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his contribution and the job he does chairing the Defence Select Committee. One of the trickiest tasks about the work that has been undertaken by our military planners is that it is not clear what circumstances any forces may be required to be deployed, and it is not clear the details of the negotiated peace deal that we all want to see will be in place. So he asked me the straight question. Actually, when the deal is done, when the peace is negotiated, the ceasefire is in place, I believe it will be easier, not harder, to hold together and enlarge the number of nations willing to be a part of the coalition of the willing. And in the meeting that I chaired at NATO headquarters 10 days ago, the first ever defence ministers of the coalition of the willing, there were 30 nations round the table there, all participating in the detailed operational military planning that is continuing. 30 nations, not just in Europe, but beyond as well.
Your General Spokesperson, Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also thank the Defence Secretary for the advanced sight of his statement. We welcome the £200 million of support for the front line to support Ukraine. Over Easter, Putin proved that he had no interest in securing peace. Within hours of declaring a supposed Easter truce, Putin unleashed a fresh wave of drone and artillery attacks across many parts of the front line. Meanwhile, President Trump has shown once again his utter indifference towards the Ukrainian people's struggle. After boasting that he would end the war within 24 hours of taking office, he now threatens to withdraw US support from mediating talks altogether. It's no wonder his efforts have failed, given his warped approach of applying pressure to Kyiv while offering the hand of friendship to the Kremlin. We cannot rely on President Trump if we want to secure a just peace in Ukraine, one which respects Ukraine's right to self-determination and proves that aggression towards neighbours does not pay. That's why the UK needs to go further and faster, together with our partners in Europe and the Commonwealth, to support Ukraine and increase the pressure on Putin. Will the Defence Secretary update the House on what steps have been taken to seize the £25 billion worth of frozen Russian assets across the UK and to deploy these to Ukraine? Will he also update the House on whether the government plans to expand the UK's designation of vessels which are part of Russia's shadow fleet and subject to sanctions, helping to further reduce Putin's ability to fund his war through exported oil revenues? We've welcomed the government's work to convene discussions on creating a reassurance force for Ukraine. The credibility of the UK's commitment to such a force would be significantly enhanced by reversing the staggeringly irresponsible 10,000 troop cuts to our army, which the Conservatives undertook while in government. Will he commit to reversing these cuts today?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome her welcome for the surge in UK support to the Ukrainian troops on the front line. It's important to really support them at this point in their close fight, and that's what we're determined to do, as well as preparing for the longer-term peace that we hope will be secured. And I just would say to her, on that question of the peace negotiations, really it is President Trump that has created this opportunity for those negotiations and for that peace. And it really is too soon to call failure on those negotiations. Everything about the determination of some of the significant US figures and the work that they're doing, the discussions that we will help support and play a part of in London tomorrow, demonstrate that there is a broad coalition of nations wanting to see a peace in Ukraine, wanting to see Putin negotiate seriously, and willing to take the steps to help bring that about. And on the question of pressures on Putin, the question of whether we can make any further use of the seized Russian state assets is something that we're looking closely at. It isn't just a question or a judgment for the UK. That will be much more powerful if that is done with other allies, particularly through the G7. And so that is if we make any progress on that front, that is the way that we will do it.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've just come back from Ukraine. I went with other members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and can certainly confirm what we all know, that there is huge gratitude and affection for the United Kingdom in Ukraine. And whatever is going on the Western Front, it is actually a war that affects the whole of the country. And even when we were in the capital, there were 3 air raids in one day. But there is a desire by Ukrainians to reciprocate and support us as best they can. And by necessity, they've become absolute experts in the use of drones and want to share their knowledge and skills with us in terms of training in the use of drones, but also in the development of them and the production of this new weapon system. Will the government be taking up this opportunity and working with the Ukrainians on this new weapon system? Yeah.
Can I thank her for the job she's doing chairing the Foreign Affairs Committee and for her commitment to Ukraine and her recent visit. I'm proud of the UK's leadership on Ukraine. I'm proud of the way that it was led by the previous government, supported by us in opposition, and I'm proud to say that the official opposition now provide the necessary support for this government to step up still further the support that we can offer. On the question of drones, it isn't just a question, as she asks, of will we do this? We have been doing this. We have been doing this for some time. And I said earlier on in response to the Shadow Defence Secretary that since the election in July last summer alone, we have gifted more than 14,000 drones to Ukraine. In some cases, those are drones that we have made, designed, developed, made here. In some cases, we've done that jointly with Ukrainian companies. And sometimes we are now making sure that they can design and develop and manufacture for themselves in Ukraine, because it is the most effective way for Ukraine to reinforce their own armed forces and their industry. And it's the quickest way of getting into the hands of their frontline troops the necessary equipment and systems they need to fight off Putin's invasion.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
What worries me is that President Putin has said that he will not accept NATO troops on the ground. But in the absence of NATO troops on the ground, could we not be back to a 1939 Sudetenland situation where the aggressor takes a slug of territory and then moves in several months later? So will the Secretary of State confirm that he is absolutely convinced, and perhaps he can convince President Trump, that in the absence of NATO troops on the ground, this is a worthless peace?
Deputy Speaker, no one is talking about NATO troops. The Coalition of the Willing is a coalition of nations, many but not all NATO members, willing to come together, discussing the military options and the planning in close liaison with NATO, because it potentially has implications for NATO. But I would just say to him, President Trump is leading the negotiations. President Putin is not yet negotiating seriously. He is not in a position to lay down terms like that. And the securing the ultimate objective that President Trump, President Zelensky, and we all want to see, which is not just a peace but a lasting, durable peace, will require reassurance, and it will require security support for Ukraine while they develop the strength of their own deterrence to do that for themselves in the longer term.
Derek Twigg.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on the work he's done in terms of securing extra funding for defence, but also for Ukraine. It is clear that Putin does not want peace. All he's interested in doing is gaining Ukrainian territory. And we have to make a very clear message to him that we're not taking a step backwards, ourselves and our allies. And the only way we can get a just settlement for Ukraine is for Ukraine to be as powerful militarily as it possibly can be, and we stop the Russians taking more territory. So can I say to my old friend, I welcome the efforts that have been made so far, the additional funding, but can I say this, and I've said it once before, we will have to increase defence spending further, and the 3% by the next election will not be enough.
Although there are many experts in this House on both sides on defence and security, my honourable friend is one of the leading voices on this and has followed it most closely for a great deal of time. I hear what he says. I know and I'm pleased that he welcomes the commitment to 2.5% of GDP on defence 3 years earlier than anyone expected in 2027, and the commitment also to raise that to 3% in the next Parliament. I know he'll also welcome that this year, as a marker of that intent, we're putting an extra £5 billion into defence spending this year. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is nothing in the discussions of the 51 nations and partners at the UDCG in Brussels that I chaired with the Germans, or the 30 nations in the Coalition of Willing that I chaired the previous day in Brussels, that suggests that the strength of those nations that stand with Ukraine is diminishing. Far from it. We are stepping up, we will step up further, and we will stay with Ukraine as long as it takes in the fight. We will stay with Ukraine for as long as it takes in the peace.
Lincoln Job.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the Secretary of State statement today. I think the House had risen for Easter recess when President Zelensky announced that 155 Chinese troops had been deployed in support of Russian forces in Ukraine. So can I invite the Secretary of State, please, to tell us how this major crossing of the Rubicon is going to change his own government's approach to China and how it might be informing his decisions with his American counterpart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think what it shows, in the same way as the way that President Putin is increasingly relying on North Korean troops to fight his battles and on Iranian missiles in order to hit Ukraine, it demonstrates an underlying weakness, not a strength, from President Putin. And as far as China goes, it is part of the very strong messages that the Chief of the Defence Staff gave and discussed with the Chinese when he visited recently his counterparts in China, that we see the importance of peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific as a matter not just for those nations in that region, that we see the future of Taiwan as necessarily one to be conducted by peaceful negotiation, not threats or conflict, and that very strong concern that stability and security and the peace continuing in the Indo-Pacific is a matter that we want China to be very well aware of.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his leadership on this topic, not just in the UK but in Europe. But my question to him is one around tactics. And over the weekend, I spoke on LinkedIn with a British sniper, former army. He's now fighting for the Ukrainians on the front line. He was telling me about the tactical changes that he has had to make to how he operates. But those tactical changes are not reflected in our own sniper training in the Army, the Royal Marines and the British Forces. So if we're talking about a coalition of the willing and potential UK troops involved in defence, when are we going to update the training syllabus for our own forces to reflect the tactics that are currently in use in Ukraine? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend speaks from a position of great experience and authority on this. Since he points to something that hits at the heart of the Strategic Defence Review that is close to being finalised, which is that it takes as a starting point, it was hardwired into the terms of reference in July when the Prime Minister commissioned it, that we need to learn the lessons from Ukraine, not in order to fight like in Ukraine, but the fact that the nature of warfare is changing. This House and the Shadow Defence Secretary has mentioned the importance of drones earlier on, that the combination of forces needs to be more integrated, It needs to be driven much more by technology, and that will have implications not just for equipment, but also for training. So I know he'll look forward to the SDR's publication. I know he'll be on the case, including from the Select Committee, to make sure that it's fully implemented, but I welcome his contribution to those debates.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Coupled with the decision of the leader of the free world to describe Ukraine as the aggressor in this war, is the news today that America may be considering no longer supplying the Supreme Allied Commander Europe to NATO. Is the Defence Secretary looking forward, as much as the rest of us are, to hearing what President Trump has to say if he comes to this Parliament as soon as September about how it is that the system that kept the peace in Europe for 50 years after the Second World War is no longer applicable for the future?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he and I will both look forward to the President's visit to this country when it is staged. I would just caution him. I mean, he's so experienced in this that to chase the sort of most recent comments or to regard them as somehow profound, I would just caution. I would say, look, the US, quite rightly, led by President Trump, reinforced by Defence Secretary Hegseth, has rightly challenged Europe to step up on defence spending, and he's nodding his head, on European security, and he's nodding his head, on Ukraine, and he's nodding his head. But Europe and other nations stepping up does not mean the US stepping away. And when our Prime Minister, was in the White House with President Trump, they had, in public, on camera, a detailed discussion about NATO, and President Trump reaffirmed his total commitment to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty.
Lillian Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Defence Secretary for your statement today to the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's clear that Russia's aggression undermines our security right here at home in the UK. Does the Defence Secretary agree with me that the outcome of this war matters deeply to every one of our constituents across the country?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, in the high politics of international peace negotiations, in the brutal drama and killing of the battlefield, it's often easy to overlook the fact that the strength of our ability as a nation, the strength of our ability as a government to offer Ukraine such support depends on the well of support of the British people. And my honourable friend is completely right that this battle for the future of Ukraine, the huge courage that Ukrainian men and women, military and civilians alike, are showing in resisting Putin's invasion, matters to us in the UK. It matters not just because, as I've said, defence of the UK and Europe starts in Ukraine, but it matters to the British people who opened their homes over 3 years ago when Putin invaded to refugee Ukrainians, and it matters to people in this country because they recognise that the Ukrainians are fighting for what we hold dear: the right to elect our own government, the right to determine their own future as a country, and to do that without the menace of a big power, of a dictator like Putin over their shoulder.
Will Forster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Defence Secretary has acknowledged MPs from across the House who have visited Ukraine, and I wanted to very briefly share that experience for myself. When I visited a Ukrainian hospital, I met a man that was suffering from a chemical weapons attack. Doctors were struggling to treat him because they did not know what chemical weapons were used. Please can the Secretary of State confirm what monitoring the MOD does of chemical weapons and other war crimes done in Ukraine, and how is the UK raising that with international partners?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we would abhor any use of chemical weapons. I'm not aware of those reports, but I will check those out and I will write to the Honourable Gentleman. But he quite rightly points to the very sharpest end of this Ukrainian fight, which is those injured servicemen and women in Ukrainian hospitals. And the UK government, I'm pleased to say, from almost month one, was putting in place UK medical support, military medical support for the Ukrainian system. We've stepped that up recently, 3 months ago, when I announced an increase in the support and the funding for that. And it's an important part of the contribution we can make to keeping Ukraine in this fight.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I very much welcome the comments made by my right honourable friend about the need to spend more of our defence funds on buying weapons made in this country. I think it's a really helpful comment, and the other day I was at BAE Systems, who are building a new factory in my constituency to produce artillery weapons, some of which I hope will go to the Ukraine. So we have a commitment from our right honourable friend that we'll supply those weapons to Ukraine while Ukraine wants them, and we'll treat with a degree of scepticism and complete contempt the comments by Putin trying to manufacture some sort of fake peace to suit his own ends.
Secretary of State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend mentions a company in his constituency. I don't know if he's also referring to Sheffield Forgemasters, which is in his constituency, a proud industrial firm in South Yorkshire there in Sheffield, which will be making British steel to supply to a new Rheinmetall artillery barrel factory that is a new investment in this country directly as a result of the Trinity House agreement that we struck in October between the UK and Germany. It will create 400 jobs in Britain. It will mean that we are able to produce gun barrels again in this country for the first time in over 10 years. And it's a good example, just like the 1.6 billion that I announced a couple of months ago for new short-range air defence missiles for Ukraine, that will see over 5,000 of those produced in Northern Ireland, creating an extra 200 jobs in Talis, in Belfast. A good example, Madam Deputy Speaker, where we can support Ukraine, we can strengthen our own national security, but we can boost economic growth at the same time.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Reassurance force sounds like a euphemism for escalation that would expose our boys and girls to very significant risk. And yet on the 3rd of March at the dispatch box, the Prime Minister said to me that we would not be deploying troops to Ukraine without a US backstop and without US security guarantee. He was right, wasn't he?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've already said this afternoon that the Prime Minister had made clear, to President Trump, as I have done to Secretary Hegseth in the US, that we support absolutely their bid to secure a negotiated peace, and we expect there to be a role for the US in helping to secure that peace for the long term. What we are leading alongside the French is a determined effort, a coalition of the willing, that demonstrates that European nations like us, with the capability and the French to lead this sort of deployment, are willing to step up and do more. But as I've said again, Europe, nations like the UK stepping up does not necessarily mean the US stepping away.
Luke Akehurst.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The strength of the unity of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group and Coalition of the Willing these past few weeks has sent an important signal at a critical time for Ukraine. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it is critical that we and allies express our unwavering support for Ukraine's right to exist, its freedom and its national sovereignty?
Secretary of State.
I do indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wonder whether he might actually join me and help me with some of my speech writing. He puts it very succinctly and much more sharply than I have today, this afternoon. This is what's at stake as the Ukrainians fight for their future, fight for their country, fight for their freedom, and it's down to us to provide them with the support that they need, both in the fight and in the efforts to negotiate a longer-term peace.
SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. There's much in it by way of a helpful update, but the key element of it for all of us should be on the final page where he says we must not allow borders to be redrawn by force, and that enjoys unanimous support. I have a question on the 4.5 billion. How much of that is rolled over from previous commitments, and will you update the House on how much of it is consumed in this financial year? How much of it is in cash support and how much of it is in materiel? And when it comes to potential air policing in Ukraine, this will be on top of air policing in the South Atlantic, QRA from Coningsby and Lossiemouth, air policing in the Baltic and the Eastern Mediterranean. It would be, would it not, unconscionable to try and do that without a substantial new order of Transport Typhoon.
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, he asks about the 4.5 billion. This is the scale of the military support to Ukraine this year. It's more than this country has committed at any time before. That is a combination of 3 billion a year this year, plus 1.5 billion from the proceeds of the seized assets that we are also deploying. We're doing this according to a joint plan with Ukraine for 2025 that we've developed, so that we look to supply what they need most.
Alex Sobel.
My old friend, the Defence Secretary, was quite right when he said that the announcement by President Putin of a pause in fighting over Easter weekend was a false promise. We see many false promises from Putin, and his aggression against not just Ukraine but against whole of Europe is really concerning. While we were on recess, he had to scramble RAF Typhoons into the Baltic to intercept an Ilyushin IL-20M spy aircraft. What more is he going to do to protect NATO air and maritime space from the aggression of Putin and Russia?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, with the simple answer is we will do whatever is required as a UK contribution to the NATO alliance. I'm proud of the leading role that the UK plays in NATO. I'm also proud of the fact that NATO now is bigger, stronger, and a better deterrent force with 32 nations than it was when Putin first launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, it demonstrates how Putin's strategic aims in launching that invasion have come unstuck, that he's failed so far to secure any of those aims. And I would say to him, as my honourable friend has just said, he says he wants peace, he says he wants an end to fighting. Now is the time, for the first time, for him to demonstrate and match his words with his actions and negotiate seriously for that long-term lasting peace.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank the Secretary of State for taking this first opportunity to make this important statement, and congratulate him on the work he's doing with the Coalition of the Willing. What's going to be important in that is understanding, building on comments from my right friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, what's going to be important in that is understanding the terms of engagement, if that is to happen, and secure a peace, because what we can't allow to happen is where there's woolly thinking, if you will, and allow a situation like Srebrenica to happen again. So can you assure me that he's working very hard and it is on the agenda of what any terms of engagement would be, and people are crystal clear about what they could be to secure the peace?
Secretary of State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the right honourable gentleman is exactly right about that. Yes, so the potential terms of engagement are a really important part of any potential planning, as are the terms of any peace process and peace settlement, because that will set the framework for the potential role of any reassurance force. But I can say to the honourable gentleman and to this House, at that point, at the appropriate point, this House will have a full opportunity to discuss and to debate these matters.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the commitment of this government, both past and present, to Ukraine. Just like this House, citizens in Norwich stand with the people of Ukraine. Yes. As the Secretary of State knows, 2.5 billion was promised for Ukraine after the sale of Chelsea Football Club by Roman Abramovich. This money remains frozen in a UK bank account, as far as I understand. Can the Secretary of State update us on any progress in unlocking this funds, which is much needed for the people of Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
If my honourable friend will permit me, I will double check with my colleagues in the department that leads on this, and I will write to her with the latest position over the Abramovich billions.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, and thank the Secretary of State very much for his statement. He always speaks softly, but he always speaks firmly, and we thank him for that. I think he represents the views of the people. The news that Russia is seeking peace talks is certainly heartening, but how will the Minister ensure that Russia understands that it is not and never will be peace at any price, and that the Allies will continue to support Ukraine until a sustainable peace is achieved, and will not be forcing Ukraine to accept a deal which does not honour the sacrifice of life or grief or loss of education and the hope of a future which so many Ukrainians have given over so many years. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
If I may say so, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was a very moving intervention, and part of the power of this place is not just ministers and government accounting to Parliament, but it is Parliament finding its voice in exactly the way the Honourable Gentleman said. And he asked me about my message to Putin. His own message and the message from this House this afternoon is strong and clear.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recently led a roundtable of large defence manufacturers at BA Systems base in Christchurch, and they had one clear message, which is they want to support Ukraine. Bournemouth stands too with Ukraine. So I particularly welcome the Prime Minister's commitment of UK contracts worth £30 million for drones to support Ukraine announced today. Will the Defence Secretary say how the UK will boost jobs and growth with defence spending to support Ukraine? And would he particularly say how Dorset defence manufacturers might be able to benefit too?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the message of support to Ukrainians from his constituents and from his businesses in Dorset there. I'd say to him, he is in a part of the country where some of the most innovative, creative companies in the defence and security field are. I'm glad to hear of the company that has recently got the £30 million contract. And I'd say to him, perhaps he might like to look at the some of the detail of the spring statement from the Chancellor, because part of the confirmation that she and I made when she made the statement was that from this point, 10% of the defence budget will in future be allocated to developing, purchasing and supplying for our own forces novel technologies, just as the sort of manufacturers that he cites from his constituency are involved in producing.
Sir Desmond Swain.
What planning is taking place amongst the Allies to make up for the 40% of armaments that have hitherto been supplied by the United States to Ukraine, should it become necessary to do so?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that was exactly the focus of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, the purpose in pulling those 51 nations and partners together 10 days ago, and in securing the confirmation of a record 21 billion euros in extra military aid for Ukraine during the course of this year. Supported by the US with the presence of the Secretary of State, the Defence Secretary Hegseth, who welcomed what he saw quite clearly was confirmation that European nations and others are stepping up to meet the challenge that he and President Trump have issued to us, quite rightly, and stepping up to meet the challenge that requires us to do more to keep Ukraine in the fight, as well as strong for a potential peace that we all hope will be negotiated too.
Jeevan Sander.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement. Keeping ourselves, Europe and Ukraine safe means we have to produce more fighting forces than Putin can, but traditionally in this country we have focused on producing exquisite and expensive platforms. Now clearly that trade-off is changing. We're seeing $1,000 drones in Ukraine destroying $9 million tanks. The production trade-off between expendable and exquisite platforms has to change across our allies and for ourselves. And producing those drones takes months, and it will take years to even upgrade our own Challenger tanks. So can the Secretary of State set out how that changing trade-off in production will be implemented and indeed introduced in both the SDR and the Defence Industrial Strategy to keep ourselves, Europe and Ukraine safe?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is spot on, and he provides the answer to his own question about how that absolutely necessary understanding from what we've seen in Ukraine and in other conflict zones in the Middle East recently, how it's got to be a combination of the more traditional, very sophisticated sort of defence platforms that we have tended to procure with the much more rapidly updated and updatable and upgradable new technologies like drones. That will be set out in the Strategic Defence Review. It will be captured in the Defence Industrial Strategy. But I hope my honourable friend will see the announcement that I've just referred to in the spring statement of a determination to earmark 10% of the defence equipment spend in future from this year on for novel technologies such as the ones that my honourable friend cites.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much welcome the robust tone of the Secretary of State's statement and indeed his responses, but I'm sure deep inside he also regrets the fact that they are not reflected by many in the US administration. And whilst across this House I'm sure we all appreciate the diplomatic challenges of dealing with President Trump and his administration, but it would be reassuring if the Secretary of State could confirm that at some level it has been conveyed that it is deeply unhelpful and indeed disconcerting to the Ukrainian diaspora in this country that President Trump does parrot Kremlin lines.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, President Trump has created this opportunity. He's created this opportunity of a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians, as a party of peace in this process, have declared they're ready to accept. He has created the opportunity for a negotiated, lasting peace. Our job is to reinforce his efforts in doing so. We are doing just that. We're supporting the Ukrainians in those negotiations. We're supporting the US and contributing to those negotiations where we can. And the next stage of that will be in London tomorrow.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our Prime Minister has convened the largest, strongest group of countries yet behind a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Does the Defence Secretary agree that the UK has a unique leadership role in securing peace, and that this extends beyond the provision of military assets to galvanising all our allies on upholding shared values, that we help our friends stand up to bullies, that we believe in sovereignty, and that we protect the rules-based system? Because in the widest sense, the long-term defence of the UK is happening in Ukraine.
Secretary of State.
I do indeed agree with my honourable friend, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK does indeed, as he said, have a unique leadership role here, alongside, in this case, the French with the Coalition of the Willing. And what I've been struck in the discussions and involvement that I've had with military planners and with defence ministers and others on this is that other nations recognise that unique role and responsibility the UK and indeed the French have. They welcome it, but in each case, every nation has a contribution to make as well, and that's what we're trying to marshal at the moment through the military planning detail and through the reinforcement of the Coalition of the Willing.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To what extent does the 39-member coalition accept that the United States is still the indispensable partner in any so-called peacekeeping operation? Because unless a peacekeeping force in Ukraine is ready and prepared to fight and to defeat the Russian armed forces, there is no point in it being there. Indeed, as my honourable friend said earlier, it would be just a victim of another tragedy. And to that extent, this EU-UK proposed defence agreement, to what extent will there be the primacy of NATO recognised in any agreement? Because again, we don't want inadvertently to send a message to the United States that NATO is over, we no longer need the Americans, we're going on our own, because we won't be capable of doing that for decades.
Secretary of State.
Well, the right honourable gentleman is right. NATO is the cornerstone of our European security. That is the fundamental and it is the starting point for any future planning. The potential for the EU and UK to strike some sort of defence and security pact or agreement is a recognition that the EU and the Commission also have a role to play, and their recognition that the UK needs to be involved in those programmes, those industry procurements, and potentially, as the Commissioner who's responsible for this has acknowledged, access to the schemes and the funding that may be available to underpin that. In the question of the US's role, look, fundamentally, what will secure Ukraine's long-term future and a lasting peace is the strength of their own deterrent capacity. The strength of the Ukraine, as they have done for the last 3 years, but in future, to deter any subsequent Russian attacks. That is one of the principal purposes of the planning for a reassurance force. But as I have argued, the Prime Minister has argued, and we've said it in this House, there is an indispensable role for the US in trying to foster and bring that negotiated peace, but also there is a role for the UK, for the US in helping to secure that for the long term as well.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and his ongoing leadership on this issue, and actually the shared voice that we have across this chamber. I know the people of Ukraine will be very pleased and very hopeful because of that. Does the Defence Secretary agree with me, though, that the lessons from Ukraine is that the nature of warfare has actually changed, and will he confirm that the Strategic Defence Review will incorporate these lessons into its findings?
Secretary of State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an argument that I've been making for some time before the last election and since. My honourable friend, from his unique experience, makes the same argument. Ukraine tells us the nature of warfare is changing. It's changing faster than ever, driven by technology. We have to adopt and incorporate those lessons for our ability in future to equip our own armed forces so they are fit to fight in the way that's going to be required to deter adversaries in the future, but also to keep us safe.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the Defence Secretary on co-chairing the 27th meeting of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. While it was also good to see the German Defence Minister chairing, this is a role that was previously carried out until the 9th of January by the US Secretary of Defence. The Defence Secretary Hegseth did attend earlier this month, but it was a remote attendance across a secure platform. If we see in the coming weeks any reduction in US air defence for Ukraine or other support, other materiel, how might the UK respond?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman has been in the House long enough to know that I can't possibly and I won't start responding to hypotheticals like that, but I would just say, look, the part of the US challenge of the new administration was to say to European nations like the UK, step up. We were stepping up, but we've done more, and we will do more in future. And one of the particular requests from the US administration was that this uniquely important and successful Ukraine Defence Contact Group, and the Honourable Gentleman is quite right, it was established by and was chaired up until the change of administration by the US, they asked us to take on that co-chairing. They asked us to take on convening it and chairing it, and we agreed to do that alongside the Germans. And that's why the 27th contact group, as he rightly said, was convened, was co-chaired by me and the German Defence Minister.
I'm going to get all members in, but it would be greatly helped if we could have shorter questions, please. Blair McDougall.
Over recess, I delivered a message of solidarity from the Church of St Andrews in Barrhead to St Andrews Church in Butcher, the site of a horrific massacre. That brutality, it was clear when I was in Kyiv, it has meant that the Ukrainians are still determined to fight, but again and again they raise their concerns about their exposure and their over-reliance on American air defence. What can we do to mitigate that? And what consideration has he given to creating an integrated air defence zone in the west of Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for being out in Ukraine, demonstrating the solidarity of this side of the House and the House in general. he will have had in his conversations from the Ukrainians that that sense from the civilian population, their overwhelming priority is their defence, as he said. It's why the announcement of the 1.6 billion that I put into new short-range defence missiles, the LMMs, to Ukraine was so important. But it's also why the work that we've done in recent months alongside Denmark to develop Gravehawk, a new innovative technical system to help reinforce Ukrainian air defence systems that we will be able to roll out more generally, is so important. And it's that combination of innovation, industrial speed and partnership with Ukraine, which in the end is reinforcing Ukraine's ability to fight for itself and protect itself.
Sir John Whittingdale.
The Secretary of State rightly began his statement by condemning the Russian missile attack on Sumy on Palm Sandy, which killed civilians and children. However, he will be aware of Russian claims that this was a military target, that 60 Ukrainian military commanders were killed, as were NATO servicemen who were, quote, in charge. Can he confirm that not only will we provide increased military support to Ukraine, but we will also step up efforts against Russian lies in the information war?
State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. These were men, women and children on their way to church. There were children that were killed as part and severely injured as part of the attack. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I know you want short questions and short answers at this stage of the statement.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I was in Ukraine before Easter, where, whilst we were in Kiev, there were 3 separate airstrikes, or air attacks, I would say. Fortunately, the air defence in Kiev is particularly good, but that is not the case elsewhere in the country. Could the Secretary of State say more about how we are supporting Ukraine on air defence, and whether we're considering supporting the new Sky Shield system?
Secretary of State.
In short, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have given, alongside drones, the highest priority to what we can do to support air defence systems in Ukraine. I've mentioned some of the recent commitments that we've made and deliveries that we're undertaking, and during the course of 2025 we will develop and deliver more of those.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, and he quite rightly drew attention to the huge losses of Russian troops in this conflict, and of course equally huge numbers of losses on the Ukrainian side. Does he see any prospect, after the unsuccessful attempts at a ceasefire over Easter, of anyone else intervening to try and bring about talks between Russia and Ukraine that could lead to a lasting ceasefire, that could lead ultimately to a settlement? Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, tried to intervene, as did the African Union and a number of Latin American leaders. This war cannot go on forever. There has to be somebody intervening to try and bring about a process that will lead to a ceasefire and thus no more loss of the tragic loss of so many people's lives.
Secretary of State.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is right. This has to end. It has to end in a process that can lead to a political and negotiated settlement. My view and the government's view is that the best chance of that, the momentum behind the negotiations at the moment that are American-led, are what we need to throw our weight behind and try and ensure can succeed.
Josh Dean.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that my constituents will have been horrified by Russia's conduct over Easter, not least the Ukrainian families that have found safety in our community. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that Russia's actions over the Easter weekend show that Ukraine is still very much in a fight against Russian aggression, that they deserve our fullest support, and will he take this opportunity to reassure the Ukrainian families in my community that that is exactly what Ukraine will have?
Secretary of State.
Well, I pay tribute to my honourable friend's community and the welcome and that they've shown to Ukrainian families that are part and parcel of their community now. And I hope his constituents and the Ukrainians amongst them will be reassured by the strength of the cross-party support in the House this afternoon for their continued fight and for our determination to try and secure with them a long-term peace.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the reports that the US have withdrawn intelligence sharing with Ukraine, does the Defence Secretary believe that's an exaggeration? And if not, Does he believe the UK and the coalition of the willing, trusted partners in that coalition of the willing, can do a workaround on intelligence sharing?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there was a moment when intelligence sharing with Ukraine was paused. That was restarted with the momentum behind the talks and the point at which Ukraine and the US were back on the same page. I'm proud to say the UK played a part in doing that, and those arrangements are an important part of Ukraine being able to withstand the onslaught from President Putin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To support our Ukrainian friends, we need a robust, sovereign industrial base. Now, one proposal to help finance this and enhance supply chain security is the creation of a multilateral armament bank, such as the proposed Defence, Security and Resilience Bank. Does the Minister agree with me that the Government should explore this potentially game-changing solution?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, I do agree with my honourable friend, and we are. It is part of the preparation for the defence industrial strategy, because we want to find ways of maximising the investment going to British firms and British jobs, making a contribution, important contribution, not just to the defence and security of our own country, but those of our allies as well.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And rightfully, this House spends a lot of time talking about Russia, but of course Russia can't act without Belarus. Would the Secretary of State update us of the discussions in terms of what Belarus's role has been in this case, and also whether that was discussed in his meetings he's recently had?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, to be quite honest with the honourable gentleman, Belarus was not discussed. It's Russia that is doing the active invasion and the attacks. Belarus is certainly an ally of President Putin, but they're not active participants in this attack on Ukraine.
Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In his statement, the Secretary of State was right to link the record level of spending on Ukraine with the opportunity for UK industry. But I'm sure he'd agree that this opportunity is also a challenge, both for scale-up of the industry and also, as we've heard, for the development cycle for new technologies as well. In addition to the support for innovation, and as we've also heard on financing, could he share whether the Department are considering additional measures to support our supply chains to build capability so that organisations like our own defence cluster in Teesside can help to take their rightful place in supporting both Ukraine and UK?
Secretary of State.
We are indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, because my honourable friend is completely right, and his long experience in industry bears this out, that having a productive capacity which is sovereign and in the UK is one thing, but if that can't be supplied by the essential components and materials required, then the strategic strength is undermined, and we're very conscious of that as we develop a new defence industrial strategy, one, Madam Deputy Speaker, we haven't had in this country since the one produced in 2021.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for his statement. But can he set out what recent steps have been taken by the government to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General in investigating and prosecuting domestic war crimes?
Secretary of State.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Speaker will be aware of this from his recent visit to Ukraine, in particular to Bucha, and the honourable gentleman will know that from the outset, the UK government, under the previous regime and this one, has continued to support, with legal expertise and funding where it's helpful, the evidence gathering and potential case building that I hope will lead to the prosecutions that he also wants to see.
Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State spoke of sending a clear signal to Vladimir Putin. I do hope that his US counterpart won't take that too literally. I would regardless prefer to be sending drones the way of President Zelensky. £25 billion in frozen Russian assets would buy an awful lot of drones. I hear what he's saying, but I plead with him to take the lead on this and let the Ukrainians win in their finest hour.
Secretary of State.
Deputy Speaker, I hear what he says. I hope he heard what I said in response to his front bench spokeswoman on that.
Bernob's ejected.
Media reports and statements from representatives of the US administration in recent days have suggested various options for Ukraine's post-war borders, many of which see the ceding of Ukrainian sovereign territory. I appreciate the Defence Secretary will not want to comment on media speculation, but given his commitment to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, ahead of those talks tomorrow, what are the government's red lines regarding any peace proposal from the US's mediator that recognises occupied Ukrainian territory as Russian? And I include Crimea within that scope.
Secretary of State.
I'm sorry to disappoint the honourable gentleman. He cites media reports and then says that he doesn't expect me to comment on them, and I won't.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, I welcome the fact that the government has once again stood firm with Ukraine as they fight to defend their territory and send a message to dictators that you cannot change borders by military force. But he has been asked twice already today. We're giving £21 billion worth in munitions, etc., to Ukraine. But there are billions of assets, Russian assets, which were seized as part of the sanctions we imposed in that regime, and we haven't got an answer from him yet. What progress is being made on that? And does he not fear, like me, that given the transactional nature of the way in which President Trump approaches these negotiations, these assets could become part of the negotiations, Russia could hold on to them and avoid the sanctions and avoid paying for the carnage that they've caused in Ukraine?
Well, as I said, the honourable lady who speaks for the Liberal Democrats, work is going on with allies on that question of the Russian assets. I'll just say to him, look, our first focus at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group was what can we do now, what can we do quickly, what can we do in order to keep Ukraine in the fight today, because it's important that we don't jeopardise the prospects of peace by forgetting about the war, and that's where the 21 billion euros of a record level of commitment came from that meeting in Brussels 10 days ago.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Thank you very much.
It better be good.
It better be good. I'll think of something quick. Madam Deputy Speaker, I return to the question of fishing, and it's right that we draw together with our European allies to fight and bring this war to an end. However, it cannot be right for the French to leverage in fishing negotiations for defence spending. Will the Secretary of State press on the Prime Minister the need to defend our fragile coastal communities and make clear to Paris that this cannot be helicopters for haddock, it cannot be mackerel for missiles?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was worth waiting for, and I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Look, my first focus as Defence Secretary is securing a defence and security agreement, and seeing that as the passport to British firms, more British jobs, as we can play our part in some of the Europe-wide procurement programmes and industrial developments we need to see.
Can I thank the Defence Secretary for his statement? I'll allow a few moments for the front benches to swap over. Which brings us to the statement on the For Women Scotland Supreme Court ruling. Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With permission, I will now make a statement to update the House on the Supreme Court judgment in the case for Women Scotland Limited versus the Scottish Ministers. This ruling brings welcome clarity and confidence for women and service providers. Single-sex spaces must be protected. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is personal to me. Before I was elected to this place, I ran a women's refuge in the North East for women and children fleeing domestic violence. I know how important it is, and always was to survivors, to have single-sex spaces based on biology, places of safety after trauma, time in a sanctuary which allowed them therapeutic support, healing from unimaginable male violence and fear. I remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, how hard countless campaigners had to fight over many decades to get any single-sex provision at all, to create women's refuges and to create rape crisis centres. And then later I remember how hard it was to convince commissioners that young homeless women trying to heal from terrifying acts of cruelty shouldn't be left in mixed-sex accommodation. I will continue to fight for that provision to ensure that women's safety, women's privacy and women's dignity is always protected. This government will continue as before, working to protect single-sex spaces based on biological sex, now with the added clarity of this ruling. And we will continue our wider work with commitment, with compassion, to protect all of those who need it right across society. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a government that will support the rights of women and trans people now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of all people with protected characteristics now and always. This is a government that will support the rights of our most vulnerable now and always. And on that, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no change to announce. Dignity and respect for all now and always. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a judgment long in the making. It began in 2018, when Scottish ministers issued guidance on the definition of a woman in the eyes of the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. That guidance stated that a woman in that Act bears the same meaning as a woman in the Equality Act 2010 and included trans women with a gender recognition certificate. For Women, Scotland challenged this guidance, saying that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex, so that a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate is a man for the purposes of the Act. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and last week the court ruled that sex in the Equality Act means biological sex. This means that a person will be considered as their biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act, regardless of whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate. I know that the women who brought this challenge have not always been treated with the respect that they deserve. And this government believes in freedom of speech, and we believe in the fundamental right to protest. But in no way does that extend to criminal damage. There can be no excuse for defaced statues of feminist icons, no excuse for threats, no excuse for harassment. Madam Deputy Speaker, such acts seek to drag down the debate away from common sense, away from the sensible view held by the majority of the British public that women need single-sex spaces, that those spaces should be protected, and that you can protect those spaces while treating trans people with respect as well. So the certainty that this judgment brings is welcome. And now, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is time to move forward. There's now a need to ensure that this ruling is clear across a range of settings, from healthcare and prisons to sport and single-sex support groups. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, as Britain's equality regulator, is working quickly to issue an updated statutory code of practice to reflect this judgment, and I look forward to reviewing that code of practice in due course. And Madam Deputy Speaker, alongside these updates, our work to protect single-sex spaces across society continues in earnest. Because for far too long, under the Conservative government, single-sex spaces were anything but, and nowhere is that clearer than in our hospitals. Year after year, the party opposite pledged to close mixed-sex wards, and yet year after year, their use not only persisted, it grew massively. And year after year, often in their most vulnerable moments, women were denied the privacy and the dignity that they deserved. Time after time, Conservative ministers, including the now leader of the opposition, came to this House and toured television studios telling the public that they were protecting single-sex spaces in our hospitals. Madam Deputy Speaker, the truth was very, very different, because as last year's data tells us, the use of mixed-sex wards rose by over 2,200%, 2,200% in 10 years under the last Tory government. There is no better example of this, of rhetoric divorced from reality, of a party playing politics with the safety of women, and we will never let them forget it. Madam Deputy Speaker, by contrast, this government will protect women's wards, and NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings, and we will end the practice of mixed-sex wards once and for all. It is not just in our NHS that we will act on behalf of women. In prisons, we will continue to protect women's safety with single-sex accommodation. In women's sport, I've always backed integrity and fairness. Biology matters for competitive sport, and sporting bodies have issued rules to reflect this. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in our prisons, in our hospitals, in sport, in a whole host of other spaces, what was true before the ruling remains true after the ruling. This government protects safe spaces for women under the Equality Act 2010. And for too many years, we've seen the heat dialed up on this debate by the party opposite, with no real action to protect women's spaces. While the use of mixed-sex wards increased under their watch, while an epidemic of violence against women and girls spread across the country, while women's health was neglected, this Labour government will deliver for women through our plan for change, driving down waiting lists month after month, tackling misogyny throughout society, and once and for all, delivering justice for survivors of violence against women and girls. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know as well that many trans people will be worried in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. So I want to provide reassurance here and now that trans people will continue to be protected. We will deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices. We will work to equalise all existing strands of hate crime. And we will review adult gender identity services so that all trans people get the high-quality care that they deserve. The laws to protect trans people from discrimination and harassment will remain in place, and trans people will still be protected on the basis of gender reassignment, a protected characteristic written into Labour's Equality Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, this government will offer trans people the dignity that too often they were denied by the party opposite. Too often, a convenient punch bag. Too often, the butt of jokes made in this place by the party opposite, culminating rather shamefully in the previous Prime Minister standing at this dispatch box trying to score cheap laughs from his backbenchers at the expense of vulnerable people. By contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government is clear. Trans people deserve safety, they deserve opportunity, and they deserve respect. Madam Deputy Speaker, this verdict is about clarity and coherence in the eyes of the law. But the Supreme Court judges delivered, along with that verdict, a vital reminder. This isn't about the triumph of one group at the expense of another. It's not about winners or losers. It's not about us or them. And that is the message that I want to reinforce here today in this House. Everyone in our society deserves dignity and respect. Those values are not and never will be a zero-sum battle. Dignity and respect for all. Those are the values that lift us up and set us free. Those are the values that define and distinguish any modern and compassionate society. And those are the values, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this government will do everything to promote and protect now and always. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement, even if it was mostly a shameless work of fiction. I could not believe my eyes or my ears this afternoon. In 2021, the Prime Minister said it is not right to say only women have a cervix. In 2022, he said it is the law that trans women are women. In 2023, he said, and I quote, 99% of women don't have a penis. I know what a woman is, and I always have. The people of this country know what a woman is. We didn't need the Supreme Court to tell us that, but this government did. A Labour government so desperate to jump on a bandwagon that they abandoned common sense, along with the SNP, who put rapists in women's prisons, and, of course, the Liberal Democrats. The Supreme Court ruling is a powerful victory for the determined women behind For Women Scotland, and for people all over the UK who know how important it is to give privacy and dignity to women and girls who need it. But it follows years of battle. Individual women took action to uphold the law at great personal cost, losing their jobs and their reputations. A few weeks ago, I met the Darlington nurses who have been forced to bring legal action after a male nurse started using their changing room. Even their union, the Royal College of Nursing, refused to represent them. Women should not have to battle the NHS or their employers through the courts. Why has it been such a battle? Because something as simple as biological reality became politicized and corrupted by activists pushing this ideology as foolish politicians cheered. Even the Secretary of State, who said that this is personal to her, stated just last year that men should access women's spaces. Whether it is female victims in our courts being forced to refer to their male sex attackers as she, or the NHS using confusing gender-neutral language, putting the health of women at risk, this is a serious matter. At every point, we have fought for women. We faced hostility from activist groups and those opposite. In 2020, when we rejected Labour's calls to introduce self-ID, or in 2021, when the then Home Secretary, the member for Witham, ordered police forces to stop recording offences by trans women in female crime statistics. The current Culture Secretary said that crimes committed by men should be recorded how they wish, that those convicted of serious sexual offences should be held in jails that match their chosen gender. It was crazy then, and it is crazy now. I spent years battling abuse from Labour MPs as I fought to uphold biological sex in government, and as I blocked the SNP introducing their mad self-identity laws. I will take no lectures from them on what to do on this issue. Women and gay rights groups like the LGB Alliance were even refused stands at the Labour Party conference. The idea that they have supported this all along is for the birds. The Foreign Secretary described opponents of self-ID as dinosaurs. Labour now says that they know what a woman is, and that transgender people should use services and facilities designated to their biological sex. They've never said this before. This is a U-turn, but we welcome it. Now that we have legal clarity, will the Prime Minister show some courage and do the right thing? Will he apologise to the member for Canterbury, who faced so many security concerns as she was hounded out by the Labour Party and was rebuked by the Prime Minister and many Labour MPs sitting there looking at me for stating what the Supreme Court has now ruled to be true? Will she apologise to the member for Canterbury? I doubt it. Will the Prime Minister crack down on the groups we saw defacing statues of suffragists over the weekend with the same energy he reserves for his political opponents? Or will we see more two-tier justice? Because the last time we saw Labour MPs standing next to them with no rebuke whatsoever. Will the Secretary of State ensure that the EHRC has the government's full support in its enforcement of the Code of Practice? And in particular, will she condemn those Labour ministers who described Baroness Faulkner's entirely correct position on the judgment as appalling? Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to root out gender ideology from our institutions. This government now has a serious job to do, as many organisations will still fail women. So I ask the following. As Minister for Women and Equalities, I published guidance for schools that made clear that toilets and changing rooms must be provided separately for girls and boys. She scrapped that guidance. Will she stand up to the unions and urgently publish what she now admits is the law? She also scrapped RHSE guidance to prevent schools from teaching contested gender ideology as fact. Will she now publish this guidance and remove materials that misstate the law? Will she act to stop passports and licences being issued with self-declared rather than legal sex? Will the government support our amendments to the data bill to ensure digital ID systems record biological sex accurately? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I heard the Secretary of State. She says that she is here to protect transgender people. Many of them were misled by Labour's misstatements on this issue. Some are now left very anxious. She has not provided any reassurance, and she should not use them as a shield to protect her failure. This isn't the end of the matter, but the beginning of the end. There is so much to do, and the Conservative Party, under my leadership, will be relentless in ensuring the government does the right thing.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to see the Right Honourable Lady in her place today. Many would run from a record like hers on these matters, but not the Right Honourable Lady. She and the party opposite had 14 years to provide clarity on the issues they now claim to take an interest in. And the Supreme Court confirmed that Labour's Equality Act is the basis for single-sex spaces and protection. But they didn't, Madam Deputy Speaker, they didn't provide that clarity. But before I turn and say a bit more about the Right Honourable Lady's record, I'll say a little bit more about mine. I will come to the questions. I will come to the questions. If the Right Honourable Lady would have some patience, I will respond to her questions. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have supported countless women and children fleeing appalling male violence, sexual violence and domestic abuse. I have campaigned for decades on women's rights. I know more than most the importance of spaces for women. I fought for them, I delivered them, I ran them. And during my time running that refuge, while Labour was delivering the groundbreaking Equality Act, which this ruling confirms sets in law the basis for single-sex spaces, what was the leader of the opposition doing? She was busy hacking the website of the leading architect of the Equality Act, forever the keyboard warrior. And she's learned nothing from her party's crushing electoral defeat last year. She held the post of Minister for Women and Equalities for 2 years and did precisely nothing, provided no clarity in the law and nothing to improve the lives of women, which got materially worse on her watch. She comes here claiming to speak for women, but let's look at her record and her party's record. An increase in stalking offences, prosecutions and convictions for domestic abuse nearly halved since 2015. The rape charge rate at a record low. Survivors of sexual violence waiting years for justice. A 2,000% increase in the use of mixed-sex wards in over 10 years. That is their record, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in terms of the questions that she asks about the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their statutory code of conduct, their statutory code of practice. I have set out that I'm expecting an updated version of that as quickly as is possible. I will work with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to implement that code of practice to make sure that everyone has the clarity that they require, and I expect the EHRC to work quickly and thoroughly on this matter. Madam Deputy Speaker, she asks about gender questioning guidance and she asks about RSHE guidance. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid that's just another area that is simply laughable. Merely months before the election was called, they published a version of the draft guidance for gender questioning children. And since that time, we had the final review published by Dr. Hilary Cass. It is right that we ensure that that guidance aligns with Dr. Cass's final review. And on the RSHE guidance, that consultation concluded after the election. We couldn't be clearer, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will always protect single-sex spaces, and on this side of the House, we are focused on delivering for women. While the Leader of the Opposition described maternity pay as excessive and called the minimum wage harmful, we are improving protections for pregnant women at work. We are ensuring that women can take maternity leave and come back to good, secure jobs. We are expanding childcare. The first 750 new free breakfast clubs open today. We've brought forward the single biggest piece of child protection legislation in a generation to protect young women and girls. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was Labour's groundbreaking Equality Act that provides the basis for single-sex spaces for biological women that has been set out today. This Labour government has a plan for change, a plan that will deliver for women. It's time for her party to get offline and get on board.
Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Far from this ruling providing clarity, trans, intersex and non-binary people are instead anxious and unsure about where this ruling leaves them, legally and practically, as they go about their lives. Does the Minister recognise that this ruling was made without a single contribution from trans people themselves? And will she ensure trans, intersex and non-binary people will be involved in any upcoming new guidance, and if so, how?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, I do believe this ruling provides much-needed clarity. I do recognise the Chair of the Select Committee's concern in ensuring that all people are treated with dignity and respect, including trans people. And my expectation is that through the development of the Code of Practice and the guidance, the EHRC will engage with a range of stakeholders with a range of different views as they develop that work and set it out in full.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. I, of course, respect the independence of the Supreme Court and the ruling it has made to interpret the law as it stands, as I do the concerns of many women and the fears, the now increased fears, of the LGBT community. I also respect what the Secretary of State had to say about her experience of working in a refuge, and I agree there is no length that we shouldn't go to ensure protection for women in that situation. But I'm sure from what she said, the Secretary of State will agree with me that that shouldn't be at the cost of the human rights and the security of another vulnerable group in society, which is what this threatens to do. And I would ask her if she could explain where now those transgender people who are fleeing violence, where they can go for refuge if they are going to be completely excluded. For years, we've seen this intolerable debate where two vulnerable groups have been pitted against each other, two vulnerable groups afraid of the same thing, violence, and mostly from men. So now the challenge for this government is to live up to the spirit of perhaps one of its proudest achievements in its previous government, the Equality Act, in protecting everyone. And I would ask the Minister, does she think it would be acceptable, if this government is not able to do that, that we see trans women forced into men's toilets to face goodness knows what sort of aggression, potentially violence there? And I would ask her if she would confirm what she says about protecting trans rights, because this government, we need some leadership from them now. And I've written to the Minister and asked her if we're going to see legislation to do that. Because we must remember that what we're dealing with here is not some hypothetical, it's real lives, real fears, real concerns amongst the LGBT community. Because equality and human rights should never be the...
Order. Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As she says, I know that she has written to me on this topic. I would be happy to meet with her, or a member of the ministerial team would be happy to meet with her to discuss this further. Where we can agree is that dignity and respect should be for all within our country. That is for women and for trans people too. And trans people should not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are. But I believe it is entirely compatible to ensure that we have a society that treats everyone with dignity and respect, whilst ensuring that single-sex spaces can continue to exist for biological women who require that safety and dignity, particularly following periods of terrible abuse. And I think it is also important that, of course, there are services that are available for trans people in addition. And often it's the case that some of those services are much better provided by those with the specialist knowledge and expertise in order to deliver that provision. I agree this should not be seen as being a conflict. And the ruling from the Supreme Court, whilst being clear about the importance of biological sex, was also at pains to stress that trans people do retain clear protections within law and should be able to live their lives free of harassment and discrimination.
Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've already been contacted by several different LGBTQ+ and trans organisations in Monmouthshire, my constituency, who are really concerned and frightened about the potential implications of this judgment. Will the Minister commit to meeting with trans people from my constituency, such as Queer Space, Abergavenny Pride and Monmouth Pride, to hear their concerns about the potential impact of this ruling?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do note my honourable friend's concern, and I can assure her that I will continue to meet with a range of stakeholders in this important area, because I agree with her that no one should face prejudice or discrimination because of who they are, and that's why we're working with the Home Office to deliver our commitment to equalise all existing strands of hate crime, to make them aggravated offences. We will work right across this House to ensure that whilst we maintain single-sex spaces for biological women, we ensure that trans people have the support and the respect that they deserve, including access to healthcare services.
Shivani Raja.
Will the Secretary of State
confirm whether she will take action. Will she take action to ensure policies and lessons in schools are not led by external organisations that are captured by contested gender ideology?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I set out in my response to the Leader of the Opposition, we will publish revised guidance where it comes to RSHE. I think it is an important principle that parents understand what is being taught to their children within their children's school, and we will ensure that that is maintained.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the last few days, calls to Switchboard, the national LGBT+ helpline in my constituency, has skyrocketed, with callers who are in fear for what this ruling means to them. Because trans people, frightened to use public loos today, know one thing. And does the Secretary of State agree? We should all be clear about this. The overwhelming threat to women and to all of the trans community is the violence that we suffer from cis men.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that male violence remains a very serious challenge that we face as a country, a challenge that this Labour government is determined to confront. But I would say to her that the ruling of the Supreme Court was clear about the importance of biological sex, but I would not want any trans person in her constituency or anywhere across the country to be fearful. I believe that everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, not to face discrimination or harassment, and that is why we will back the police to ensure that action is taken against anyone who behaves in that way.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd be grateful if the Secretary of State could focus on her government and the future implications of this judgment. In her statement, she said NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings. And if I can read to her what the Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust has in its guidance currently, it says patients should always be treated as the gender they identify as, regardless of what their transition looks like or how long they have shared their identity with others. Patients should always be in an environment that aligns with their gender identity. Would she say to Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust that they need to actually act very quickly to change that guidance?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my colleagues and officials in the Department of Health and Social Care are in contact with NHS England to ensure that guidance is set out rapidly to give the clarity that is required arising out of the Supreme Court judgment. And if the Right Honourable Lady would share with me the details that she's just read out there, I would happily make sure that that is investigated further.
Preet Gill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the ruling from the Supreme Court and the Minister's statement. The Supreme Court has been clear that Sex and the Equality Act 2010 means biological sex. The question now turns to how we make sure that the Equality Act is properly understood and implemented. So can the Secretary of State state how she will ensure that public bodies, third sector organisations, sports bodies, regulated sectors and so on comply with the Act so women's safety, privacy and dignity is protected?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, we'll work with the EHRC to provide further guidance to service providers, including through their update to the Statutory Code of Practice. We expect the EHRC to do that as rapidly as possible, recognising that this is a thorough and detailed piece of work. But it is important that service providers arising from this ruling by the Supreme Court now have the clarity and confidence that was always there in the Equality Act 2010.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. The Supreme Court's ruling goes a long way to guarantee the rights and safety of women and girls. But does the Minister agree with me that the judgment highlights why it's now right for the SNP government to finally ditch the divisive gender self-ID agenda once and for all, and proves it was totally wrong for Scottish Labour to back the SNP Gender Recognition Reform Bill?
My understanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the Scottish Government do not intend to progress their gender recognition reforms. My officials will work with the EHRC, who will in turn also work with the Scottish Government. I believe Scottish ministers have indicated, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they wish to engage with the EHRC on this guidance, which is an important and welcome development.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent a constituency which shows tolerance to people from all backgrounds, and unlike the political hot potato this has become in this place and in political dialogue. I have a constituent who has been transitioned in the 1970s. She's used female toilets now for more of her life than she ever did any other toilets. Are we saying that her dignity and her respect that the Secretary of State has talked about is going to be any way improved if there is a ban on her using the toilets that she's been using for so many years?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court made clear that the provision of single-sex spaces is on the basis of biological sex. But what I would say to my right honourable friend and to her constituent is that through the development of the code of practice that the EHRC will be setting out, they will make sure that businesses and others ensure that there is dignity and respect for all, that there is appropriate provision, including the use of toilet facilities, so that no one, including trans people, must feel unsafe when they use public toilets.
Sarah Dyke.
Madam Deputy Speaker, everyone must be able to access services with the dignity upheld and privacy respected, including women and trans people. But following the Supreme Court ruling, many people are feeling confused and concerned. We must not allow this to lead to further heated arguments and toxicity. So what steps is the Minister taking to develop the critical guidance needed to give businesses and public bodies clarity on how this ruling should be implemented so everyone is treated with the dignity that they deserve?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will work with the EHRC on that guidance. They will present a revised code of practice that I will review and will present in due course. It is important that they do that as quickly as possible, but as I say, this is a complex area that must be undertaken thoroughly, including engagement with a range of stakeholders, including businesses, for the reasons that the Honourable Lady identifies.
Charlotte Nichols.
This verdict raises as many questions as it answers, and indeed has been referred to by the civil servant Melanie Field, who oversaw the Equality Act's drafting and passage, as having, quote, significantly reinterpreted Parliament's intentions. These questions are primarily about what the purpose of a gender recognition certificate is now, whether exclusion from single-sex spaces is merely lawful or required, but also in protecting women's spaces such as toilets from predatory men pretending to be trans women. What exactly stops those same men from now accessing them, pretending to be trans men?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand the concern that my honourable friend expresses and why she raises the question she does today in this House. But I do have to say to her that the position of this government is that the Supreme Court has provided clarity and confidence in this area, particularly where it comes to single-sex spaces being on the basis of biological sex, and the basis for that was the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced.
Caroline Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I am pleased to get the clarity from the Supreme Court judgment. People on this side have always known what a woman is. The Right Honourable Lady says she's going to ensure that the government implements and ensures that the public services are fully compliant with the legislation, which is good. Could she clarify, she's talked about NHS single-sex wards and their provision for biological females and biological males. Could she confirm, does that mean that trans women will be cared for on male wards?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the basis for NHS provision and the basis for single-sex services of all kinds will be on the basis of biological sex.
Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I firstly welcome and thank the Secretary of State for the measured way which she has delivered this statement, but also for her robust work on this issue. Last week's landmark Supreme Court judgment not only provided clarity, but some long overdue common sense. For too long, the issue has at times been toxic and has caused a great deal of harm to both women and trans people. So can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm to the House that her department is liaising with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to seek assurances that they will work not only at pace but also to set some clear timelines in relation to updating the statutory guidance, and will she also ensure that any guidance that is now unlawful is withdrawn?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can give my honourable friend the assurance that we will work as quickly as possible with the EHRC in this important area. I also think she is right to highlight the importance of good temper where it comes to different views on this topic. recognising that people have held strongly held views over a number of years, but where we do that, we respect one another, and that where we disagree, we do not descend into hate-filled rhetoric or involve ourselves in some of the unfortunate and deeply regrettable protests in terms of the nature of the defacement of statues and hate-filled rhetoric. Now is the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, arising from the Supreme Court judgment, to draw a line under this, to make sure the right guidance is in place and to ensure that clarity is there for all.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the Secretary of State's words around reducing the temperature on this. There are an awful lot of people who are hurting a huge amount this week as a result of the announcement that's been made, and I appreciate the commitment to reduce the temperature on that, and I hope that everybody would sign up to that. The SNP welcomes the clarity that's been offered on the definition in the Equality Act and notes the judgment's points of interaction between the 2010 and the 2004 Act. Also notes the commitment of the Secretary of State and the EHRC to deliver the guidance as quickly as possible on the new Code of Practice. I would like to ask the Secretary of State if and when she'll be replying to the letter that was sent from the Scottish Government seeking a meeting with UK Government in early course, and I would urge her to undertake that meeting as soon as possible, please.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would of course be happy to engage with colleagues from the Scottish Government. I'll respond to that letter as quickly as I can.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very conscious that I represent many trans, intersex and non-binary constituents, and that the representations that I've had made to me in my office over the past few days has been a very clear message that they're feeling particularly victimised and quite scared for their own safety. Some are trans women and some are trans men who seem to be very much lost from this debate. But the one thing that really unites them is that they're worried about their day-to-day safety. So can I ask the Minister to provide some assurance to trans people right across the country that the Equality Act is still there and can protect them from discrimination and harassment?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. They retain protection from discrimination and harassment, and I can say very clearly to this House that trans people should not be treated, should not be victims of discrimination or harassment. They deserve dignity and respect. And that's why it is important that we also ensure that trans people have access to high-quality healthcare services, and that we also clamp down on hate crimes, including those that are targeted at LGBT people.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Supreme Court's ruling and congratulate For Women Scotland and others who have campaigned tirelessly on this, despite the abuse, threats and attempts to silence them. Could the Minister please confirm what discussions either the Prime Minister or anyone on the front bench at the time had with Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, when he whipped his MSPs to vote in favour of the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Bill? And does the Labour front bench now regret some of their previous decisions where they have sided against women across the country, voicing their very real concerns?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, where I can agree with the Honourable Lady is that no one should face threats, intimidation or harassment for expressing their views. That is an important principle in our country around freedom of speech, but it should not cross a line. Where it comes to the approach that we take in Scotland, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party has indicated that he welcomes and supports the Supreme Court judgment.
Dawn Butler.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if anyone else in the House has butch lesbian friends and have been with them when they've been told to get out of women's toilets, but I have. And it is not pleasant and it's not nice. So those people that are using this as a political football, again, should be ashamed of themselves. Madam Deputy Speaker, people didn't understand. If you're saying that trans women have to use men's toilets, and as my honourable friend said, trans men then have to use women's toilets, how are you going to stop them? By asking to see their genitalia? It makes no sense. But does my honourable friend agree with me that the service providers for refugees who provide a vital service for women in desperate need and often use their discretion are now fearful that they can no longer use their discretion when providing services?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court judgment set out that single-sex spaces are provided on the basis of biological sex, but I do recognise the concern that my honourable friend raises. Lesbians should not be treated in a discriminatory way, and we must ensure that there are toilets and facilities available for everyone within our country. So I just say to her that through the guidance that the EHRC will set out, there will be additional clarity provided in the areas that she has identified.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In some ways, the biggest question today is why it took a Supreme Court's decision to confirm this position in the Equalities Act. I've met with so many. I've heard so much regarding women who are considering to stand as candidates, who are reluctant to do so because of the toxicity in public life. And I think this debate is probably one of the most toxic in terms of misogyny going towards women. I'm lucky, I'm a man, I haven't experienced to the same extent nowhere near what women have experienced. But would she take this moment to reject and to stand up for all women who have campaigned on this issue, reject the abuse and hostility that's put towards them, the importance of their dignity and respect, and thank Women in Scotland for the work they've done taking this forward?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do recognise the good intentions that the honourable gentleman has when he asks that question, but I tell him, like many women in this House, I've experienced that too, and we know what it's like as women to face that kind of abuse, and it is important that whilst we recognise that there can be no place for that kind of abuse of women in public life, we have a responsibility to change that culture, to change that climate, and to encourage women to come forward and stand for elected office.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, since I've been in this House, I have felt the force of the lobby, which has made people and MPs across this House stand there and say that trans women are women. What happened last week was the Supreme Court said that Sex and the Equality Act is actually biological sex. That I welcome, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is the Secretary of State going to do to deal with the types of damage, or the damage that Mermaids and Stonewall has caused for a generation? That's 14 years. Under a Tory government, what steps is she going to take to make sure that they rectify the damage they've done to a generation of trans and gender questioning children?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise my honourable friend's long-standing interest and campaigning in this area. She is right that the Supreme Court judgment provides clarity in terms of biological sex. What I would also say to her where it comes to support for gender questioning children, where we are talking about children and young people, this has to be about their well-being, because we are often talking about young people who are very vulnerable, who are experiencing real difficulties in their lives. And Hilary Cass's review made clear that young people in that situation do need support, do need protection, and that is why we will this year also publish revised gender questioning guidance for our schools as well, to provide that further clarity that is needed.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd firstly like to ask the Secretary of State how we are all going to be asked to prove our birth sex, because as the other honourable member said, this is not just about people who are transgender, non-binary and intersex, but also people who don't conform to gender stereotypes. And I need to share with you my constituents, one who told me, "It seems I am going to be ghettoised into trans spaces," and another who said this ruling sends a message that we do not belong, however much we contribute. So what does the Secretary of State suggest I say to those constituents, and will she join me and the honourable member for Bournemouth East in meeting Dorset's Space Youth Project for LGBT young people when they visit Parliament next week?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say to the honourable lady's constituents and trans people across this country that the ruling was clear that whilst single-sex spaces are on the basis of biological sex, trans people retain in the law protection from discrimination and harassment, and we as a government will always ensure that trans people have the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Research shows that half of trans people already fear using public toilets. So I am deeply, deeply concerned about the impact by of comments by the Minister and the Prime Minister's spokesperson that trans people should use a toilet that many of them would not feel comfortable or safe in. So I ask, how would trans people's exclusion from toilets they have long used be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, as the Supreme Court judges and Equality Act dictates? And would the Minister like to clarify that there is nothing in law, in fact, which requires trans women to use men's toilets, or trans men to use women's toilets, or non-binary people to use one corresponding with the sex they were assigned at birth?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court's judgment was clear on biological sex. But I do understand and recognise the need to ensure that there is provision, including toilet facilities and other provision in place for everyone within our society. That's why many businesses, many service providers also provide unisex provision, why many service providers will also put in place enclosed bathrooms that do not require people to make that decision to ensure that their dignity and privacy is respected. That is important for all people in our country, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Practical question. Does the ruling apply retrospectively? So if anyone was to have lost their job for their views or won a title in sport, for example, does it apply retrospectively, yes or no?
I think the honourable gentleman is referring to employment law cases, and I would have to defer to legal colleagues on that. What the judgment did, however, set out was that it was the Equality Act 2010 that is the basis for single-sex spaces being determined on the basis of biology. They determined that was always the case, had always been the case since 2010, and it was his party that failed to provide that clarity in 14 years.
Tan Singh Desi.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The unanimous Supreme Court judgment has provided clarity about the application of the Equality Act 2010. And it is incredibly important that hard-earned women's rights and single-sex spaces are protected, while also protecting our trans community who continue to face considerable discrimination. So there needs to be a solution whereby they too are treated with dignity. Does my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, agree that this entire issue needs to be dealt with a great deal of sensitivity and sensibility, rather than it being treated as a political football or as a culture war issue?
I agree that the Supreme Court judgment provides much needed clarity and certainty, including to service providers, but I also agree with my honourable friend that we need to make sure that this is dealt with sensitivity. I think particularly whereas we have done a number of exchanges in this House that we are talking about children who might be gender questioning, might be experiencing significant issues around their well-being. And I want to make sure that right across society, women have the access to single-sex spaces that they need and that they deserve, and that, as he has said, they have long campaigned for, but the trans people too receive appropriate support, including healthcare support, and do not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
While the Supreme Court's ruling brings clarity to some, it brings undeniable fear and uncertainty to others. And the Minister's statement today still leaves vulnerable trans people lost in a maze of complex equalities law. She talks about dignity and respect. Take just one setting for which her government is responsible. Our prison system is dangerously dysfunctional. So what safeguards will now be strengthened so that no trans person is placed in greater danger as a direct result of this ruling?
I'm afraid to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I disagree with the Honourable Lady that it was complex. I think the ruling was very straightforward and very clear and has provided clarity that has been sadly lacking for many years. To her question around prisons, of course it is important that vulnerable prisoners receive the support that they need, but the basis of single-sex spaces are determined, as the Supreme Court ruled, on the basis of biological sex. But of course, yes, where there are vulnerable prisoners, different situations may need to be put in place separate to that.
Chian Wara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I am quite frankly astounded that the Leader of the Opposition seeks to portray herself as a champion of women's rights when she has refused to recognise the reality of discrimination and harassment of women and stripped the funding from so many of the services that protect women. And I would also like to pay tribute to the many members of this chamber who have worked publicly and privately to protect single-sex spaces and the rights and dignity of trans people. Now, the judgment clarifies that single-sex spaces do not have to offer services to trans women. Does my right honourable friend, can she say whether they are obliged to refuse services to single-sex women?
Minister.
Spaces that operate on a single-sex basis must do so on the basis of biological sex, but of course providers are able to offer, should they choose, inclusive services so long as they are clear about who they are offering their services to. And I agree with my honourable friend that what we saw under the last government was a shameful record where it comes to prosecution of rape, prosecution of domestic violence, where rape in this country was all but decriminalised.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will recognise that there are many women, former supporters of her party, who voted for candidates like me entirely because of the record that we had for supporting biological women. However, in the meantime, given that a number of trade unions claim that they will ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court and in some cases even campaign against it, what plans does the government have to ensure that all trade unions are made to recognise that the Supreme Court ruling applies to them too?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't really know where the Honourable Lady's been since July, but her party suffered a devastating general election defeat. That's why she sat there and not over here.
Steve Brace.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my trans, intersex and binary and non-binary residents next to and their relatives have been in touch with me to express their concern and fear after the decision last week. Can the, I know that the Secretary of State mentioned this in her opening statement, can she recommit, though, to the ambitious agenda that we do have to advance the dignity and respect of trans people over the course of this Parliament?
Minister.
I understand my honourable friend's concern, and what I would say to his constituents and to trans people across our country is that we are working with the Home Office to deliver our commitment to equalise all existing strands of hate crime to make them aggravated offences. We will also bring forward a draft conversion practices bill in line with the King's Speech and our manifesto that will be trans inclusive. We're clear that that ban must not cover legitimate psychological support, treatment or non-directive counselling, but we are clear that conversion practices are abuse and we will legislate to stop them.
Carla Denyer.
Mr. Speaker, many people are feeling deeply worried about the Supreme Court judgment and what it means for their ability to live their lives in dignity and in privacy. So, will the Secretary of State make a commitment to uphold trans people's fundamental rights, including the right to privacy, given that the Gender Recognition Act was created in part to do that, but the Supreme Court ruling risks dismantling that by forcing trans people to out themselves multiple times a day whenever they visit the toilet, in their workplace, in public buildings, or indeed in the hospital?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sorry, but I just disagree with the questions that the Honourable Lady poses. The ruling from the Supreme Court was clear that whilst single-sex spaces are to be delivered on the basis of biological sex, the judgment also set out that trans people must be free to live their lives free of discrimination and harassment and retain clear protections within law.
That's right. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister will know there is considerable concern and fear amongst transgender, intersex and non-binary people across the UK, including in my constituency. But will the Minister outline what urgent steps the government is taking to reassure my trans and non-binary constituents that their rights remain protected under UK law, and to ensure that this ruling is not misinterpreted or misused to undermine their dignity, safety and access to services, or lead to discrimination on a wide scale, including wrongly challenging people trying to go about their lives in our communities?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the rights of trans people are respected and retained following the Supreme Court judgment. The ruling was very clear about that, and it is important that we emphasise that point here today. Alongside that, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will ensure that hate crime is properly recorded and punished, because trans people and all people in our country deserve to live their lives free from discrimination, harassment and hate.
Gregory Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Patients not only deserve to be treated in single-sex wards, but also be treated, especially when they're having intimate exams, by clinicians of the gender and sex that they wish. So is she concerned, as I am, about the General Medical Council that is going to carry on with its policy to remove and hide biological sex from the medical register? What discussions is she having with the General Medical Council and the other medical regulators about this issue?
Minister.
I agree that it is important that patients have the right to single-sex provision and to the access to single-sex provision around clinical treatment. But I'd just point out to the honourable gentleman that he might want to have a word with the Leader of the Opposition about the massive increase in the use of mixed-sex wards under his party.
Zara Sultana.
And Deputy Speaker, in Britain today, trans women are denied safe housing, refused essential healthcare and left waiting years for gender-affirming treatment. This is not accidental. It is the result of a climate of hostility against a marginalised community fuelled by people in positions of power, including in this very chamber. So let me be clear, trans people are not a debate, a culture war or an ideology. They are human beings and trans rights are human rights. So I ask the Minister, will this government ensure that it doesn't pander to hate? Will it reverse its damaging rollback of LGBT+ rights, including the ban on puberty blockers, and unequivocally defend the Equality Act and the protections it provides for trans people across the UK?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady asked a number of questions there. What I can say to her is that trans people, of course, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and they retain rights to live their lives free of discrimination and harassment as set out in the Supreme Court judgment. She asks about puberty blockers. I'm afraid there is going to be no change to government policy in this important area.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now we've got confirmation from the Supreme Court what the definition of a woman is. Could the Secretary of State confirm that all public sector and private sector bodies will apply that definition with immediate effect?
Secretary of State. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Equality and Human Rights Commission will set out a statutory code of practice that will provide further clarity. But I would just say to the honourable gentleman that I'll take no lectures from his party about the importance of defending women's rights, given that one of his own number that sits on those benches was convicted and went to prison for assaulting his former partner. Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are some days I'm really proud to be an MP and the level of debate in this chamber. And there's some days like today when, quite frankly, the Leader of the Opposition was absolutely appalling. She continues to talk over people, not listen, laugh at people while they're talking about an issue that is very, very serious. People out there are scared as a result of this judgment, and they will... Could you maybe let me speak? Sorry, apologies. Sorry, could the honourable member allow me the politeness of not speaking over me?
Keep going.
My question, and I will ask a question, when it...
Order. I do appreciate that feelings are running high in this statement. However, please do ask your question and put it on the record.
Do you think that, does the Secretary of State agree with me, the debate in this chamber is listened to by those people who are today scared, and the behaviour of the Leader of the Opposition in talking over people, laughing at people, and when cis men violence was mentioned, the opposite benches laughed. Yeah. That does not reassure women or trans women in this country. Does she agree?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that where we discuss these matters, they are sensitive and they do generate strong feelings. And it is, of course, right that in this House we are able to engage in robust discussion, including on issues that might at times be difficult. But I accept the point that my honourable friend is making, that we do need to treat one another with respect and understand the need. So much for dignity and respect, eh?
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the clear ruling from the Supreme Court, and I thank the Secretary of State
for her statement. However, I'm really disappointed that there was no mention of schools at all in her statement. Many schools are teaching gender ideology as if it is fact. They are not providing single-sex facilities and single-sex sports teams. How will she ensure that they now, going forwards, comply with the rules and the law, as it has always been?
Secretary of State.
I'd suggest to the Honourable Lady that after this session she reviews Hansard.
Oh, please.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the welcome clarity from the Supreme Court that Labour's Equality Act has always contained the right to single-sex spaces for women, as well as protections for trans people, does the Secretary of State agree that the SNP Scottish Health Secretary must urgently get a grip and ensure the NHS is upholding the law, especially in my area of Fife, where it appears that a nurse, Sandy Peggy, was disciplined by NHS managers for trying to access her right to use a single-sex changing room?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend will understand that I'm not in a position to comment on ongoing cases, but what I can say to her is that I agree that the Supreme Court ruling demonstrated that the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced is the basis on which single-sex provision based on biological sex should be delivered.
Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that the ruling provides clarity, but with trans constituents that I met and corresponded with over the weekend, it provides anxiety and fear. A local media outlet, the Stray Ferret, last week published an article documenting a 60% increase in trans hate crime in the last decade in North Yorkshire alone. I and many others worry that the rhetoric and language around this issue will only fuel that. So can the Secretary of State confirm how the government will ensure trans people, who are already disproportionately targeted, are not marginalised further, and that the upcoming EHRC guidance addresses the safety and inclusion as seriously as it does the legal clarity?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court was clear, but he is right that there can be no place for hate and no place for people to be targeted on that basis, and it is important that action is taken against those who perpetrate hate crime.
Mayor Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of my colleagues today, I am truly exhausted by the cynicism of the cultural wars around this topic, and I hope we can focus on how we make any changes work practically. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that all of us in this House should be mindful that there are human beings affected by every comment we make on this matter, and how we behave here will inform how the wider public behave, which I hope would be with kindness and compassion.
I agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that everyone in our society should be treated with dignity, with compassion and respect. And the Supreme Court ruling, while setting out its position on biological sex, was also clear that trans people retain important protections in law, including where it applies to discrimination and harassment. And I do believe it is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, that all of us share that message in understanding the ruling and in making sure that it is well understood across our country, because the last thing that any of us would want is for trans people to be fearful.
That's right. Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want everyone treated with dignity and respect, as the Supreme Court made clear. But should women have to rely on a court ruling followed by guidance at some point from the EHRC rather than the clear view of this House? And what would the government's view be of primary legislation in this area rather than relying on a court ruling?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling of the Supreme Court was that the Equality Act, which was passed by this House, is the basis for the protections that exist in law on the basis of biological sex.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've had very constructive discussions with constituents on both sides of this debate. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that those who seek to promote trans rights with sexually aggressive placards or through aggressively threatening women who disagree with them in the most disgusting ways, as we've all seen, do tremendous harm to the trans cause and should realise how counterproductive their slogans are to the cause that they're attempting to promote?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, no one should be targeted through the use of vile placards containing abuse or hate, and he is absolutely right. I agree with him. Not only is that wrong, but as he says, it is completely counterproductive. It does nothing to advance the discussion that those who present those placards would wish. And it is important whilst I understand that people have strong opinions in this area, that through any discussion or any debate, that does not take us to hate-filled rhetoric, threats of violence or intimidation.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that her position on these issues is very clear and hasn't changed at all over the years, and she's promising to work at pace now. And yet, 9 months into her time as Education Secretary, the guidance that was consulted on over a year ago has still not been published on gender questioning children. So can the Secretary of State help schools by answering this question? Can it ever be right for a school to socially transition a child without talking to the parents first?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will set out guidance this year for gender questioning children. It is important because I will answer the question. I will answer the question directly if the Right Honourable Lady would just allow me a moment. We will publish the guidance later this year. I recognise the importance of providing clarity to school leaders, and we inherited a draft version that it was important we looked at and engaged with stakeholders following the final review of the final CAS review. But yes, I do agree that it is important that parents are involved in important decisions about their children's lives. There will always, alongside that, be potential safeguarding considerations that also need to be taken into account. That's why we are looking at these areas very carefully to make sure that we get that right and we provide the clarity that school leaders, quite rightly, are asking for.
Chris Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right that we need to conduct this debate with respect and compassion. Excuse me, because ultimately this is about people's lives and their rights. And that's why there is such concern in the trans community at the moment, including in my Brighton Kemp Town constituency, which has the largest trans community in the country. So can she confirm two things for me? First, how will she ensure that trans people have faith that their existing legal protections will be upheld and not rolled back on? And secondly, how will the government ensure that trans voices are heard as public bodies roll out their response to this ruling?
Secretary of State.
On the two areas that my right honourable friend asks, yes, absolutely. The trans people retain important protections in law, and the ruling of the Supreme Court puts that beyond doubt. Secondly, to the question he asks around ensuring that trans voices are heard, it will be important that the EHRC, as part of their consultation in developing the code of practice that will be required to provide further clarity, engage with a range of voices as a part of that, and I'm confident that will happen.
Jim Allister.
Given that Article 2 of the Windsor Framework ridiculously requires Northern Ireland to be in dynamic alignment with EU equality directives, which include embracing self-identification, what steps will the government take to ensure that this common sense ruling of the Supreme Court is applied consistently and without adulteration across the whole United Kingdom now and always?
I will review the questions that the Honourable Gentleman asks and write to him with a full response.
Tom Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Supreme Court asked that politicians not weaponise their interpretation of law set down by Parliament. It's almost like they had anticipated the Leader of the Opposition. Yeah. The public are watching, and wherever they stand on this debate, they are not seeing a potential Prime Minister in the Leader of the Opposition. Because trans people are worried and they are scared, it's important to give reassurance. The Supreme Court clearly said that trans people remain protected under the Equality Act, regardless of whether they have a gender recognition certificate. The Supreme Court said that it could not rule on the definition of a woman other than its use in the Equality Act. As I say, my constituents, who are trans, and their allies, are deeply scared. Will the Secretary of State stand at the dispatch box and repeat her support for trans people in my constituency and around our country? And I want to repeat the invitation from my honourable friend, the member for Mid Dorset North Pool. At my invitation, young trans people from Bournemouth and Dorset are coming to this place to know that this is their parliament, that they have a place here. They are listened to and respected and have dignity. Would she or a minister come and meet with them?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll review the request that my honourable friend makes, if he could provide me with additional details so that I can do that. But I do agree with him about the importance of reassurance. that trans people should be free to live their lives with compassion, with dignity and respect, and the ruling of the Supreme Court made that very clear, that they retain legal protections, and it is important that we all convey that.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and her emphasis on the need for sensitivity and indeed good temper in dealing with this topic. And in that spirit, could I ask her to salute the courage of J.K. Rowling, Sharon Davis, and indeed the Honourable Member for Canterbury?
Madam Deputy Speaker, over many decades, fantastic women have campaigned for the protection and creation of single-sex spaces, have fought against violence against women and girls, have led some brilliant campaigns, and I pay tribute to all of those women, many of them unsung heroes whose names we'll never hear anywhere and whose names will never be mentioned in this chamber, for their fantastic campaigning efforts. It is only because of the amazing work of feminists from the 1970s onwards, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have rape crisis centres and women's refuges.
Tracy Gilbert.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the statement made by the Secretary of State. And I want to put on record my thanks to For Women Scotland for their tireless work over a number of years, where they were the public face of many women who have experienced discrimination, abuse and personal loss for making the argument that the Supreme Court made last Wednesday. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court held up the rights of lesbians to be able to associate with same-sex attracted women. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that lesbians and gay men are able to associate without face of challenge?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court ruling makes that clear and provides the clarity that many have been asking for, including lesbians and gay men, and the EHRC Statutory Code of Practice will provide further clarity. But I agree with my honourable friend, no one should have faced abuse or intimidation or harassment for expressing their legitimately held opinions.
Sammy Wilson.
While the Scottish National Party may see this as a judgment made by judicial bigots, most people will see this as a decision of common sense and will indeed will wonder why the courts had to decide what was a man and what was a woman. But given the intolerant, threatening and violent response from the trans lobby, can the Minister assure us that this judgment will not be undermined by the guidance which she issues to this House, and that vulnerable people, sports teams, hospital patients, teachers, children will be protected by this and not be adversely affected as they have been in the past? And can she also give us assurance that she will ensure that it is raised at the highest level of government that Northern Ireland must be included in these protections?
Secretary of State.
The Supreme Court judgment was clear and is welcome and necessary, but what it also set out was that the basis for that protection for single-sex spaces is rooted in the Equality Act. So those provisions were always there, but now we have the clarity that many have been calling for. Whilst I note his understandable concern about the behaviour of a minority that crosses a line into conduct that is potentially criminal and certainly unacceptable, I think we do need to tread with just a bit of care, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we don't lump everyone into that category. I'm sure that wasn't the Honourable Gentleman's intention, setting out that whilst there can be no place for intimidation or threats of violence, people do have the right to express their opinions in line with our long-standing rights in terms of freedom of speech.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Equality Act is a vital piece of legislation that's there to protect the essential rights of oppressed groups, including women and of trans people, in a world still far too dominated by sexism and bigotry, including transphobia. I used the Equality Act plenty of times to represent people as a lawyer before I came into this place. The House will no doubt discuss the impact of the recent court judgment again, but when we look online and in some of the media, can we try to ensure that debate respects all groups, including trans people, because some of the stuff spilling out of the right-wing press and online in recent days is truly, truly awful. And it's been raised with me by trans constituents who are just trying to get on with their lives.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Equality Act was one of the last Labour government's proudest achievements in ensuring that people are able to live their lives free from discrimination and prejudice and harassment. So I agree with him that in recognising that important and landmark piece of legislation, we ensure that when we discuss what are can be difficult and sensitive issues for some, we seek to do so in understanding that, as he says, people just simply want to get on and live their lives free from discrimination, harassment and abuse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2022, sitting at Wormley Community Centre doing telling at the local elections, a woman came out after she'd just voted and said, "I've just voted Conservative because you're the only party that knows what a woman is." So the British people really do care about this. So can the Minister be more specific on a time when she will issue guidance to schools about gender questioning children?
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I've already said on a number of occasions in this House, we will be issuing that guidance this year.
Tristan Osborne.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome the clarification and statement by my right honourable friend? I think the way she's reasonably dealt with questions in the House today is testament to her fortitude and her ability. Can I ask a number of different groups in my constituency who made representation, Hilary Cook from Medway Pride and women's advocacy groups, there is a worry around some of the elements around harassment and discrimination that some might take an opportunity to target the trans community. Can she guarantee this afternoon that the Labour Equality Act stands and prevents abuse, harassment against and discrimination?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Equality Act does stand and it provides clear protections within law for women and for trans people too. It is important that women have access to single-sex spaces such as women's refuges and rape crisis centres, but it is also important, of course, that trans people have access to high-quality healthcare and appropriate support services too, and in addition to that, the ability to see the police take action against hate crime.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. And anybody watching this at home today will think that the lunatics have taken over the asylum, which they quite clearly have. Now, I don't need a Supreme Court judgment or ruling to tell me that a bloke shouldn't be in a women's changing room. So I want to ask the Secretary of State a very simple question for more clarity. Can a woman have a penis?
I tell you what, blokes shouldn't beat up women. Maybe he should have a word with his colleague.
James Asser.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State will not be surprised to hear that I've had a lot of correspondence on this, and there is great concern amongst the trans community what the impact is, but also the wider LGBT community, that in this populist age it may signal a move away from the progress on LGBT rights. I welcome, therefore, her statement that there is going to be guidance. Can she make sure that is very clear and widely distributed so it is understood? But can she also assure the LGBT community and this House that this government and this party, as it long has, stands foursquare behind the advancement of LGBT rights, and we will defend any attempt to row back the progress of the last 30 years or the gains of the last Labour government?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my humble friend is right to draw attention to the advances made over many decades to ensure that LGBT people are treated with dignity and have the support and ability to participate in public life that, frankly, for many people from many years ago was just simply not the case. We have made enormous progress in tackling prejudice and discrimination, and this Labour government will always ensure that whatever someone's background, they have every opportunity to take part in public life, to achieve all that they are capable of. And the Equality Act, one of the proudest achievements of that last Labour government, enshrines in law the right to freedom from discrimination and harassment for women, and yes, also for trans people too.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her answers and her statement. This ends years of confusion around sex-based protections. Being a woman is a matter of biology, not identity, and certainly not paperwork. This judgment is welcomed by women and children, and I believe many others. And does the Secretary of State not agree that this is not an eradication of rights for any person in this United Kingdom, but is an underlining of protection? And what discussions will take place with Cabinet colleagues to see an end, for example, posters for birthing people terminology and other such phrases being used in the NHS, and instead return to the court-declared definition of women through health trusts in this UK. Today is a good day for women, a great day for the law, and a wonderful day for the people and for truth.
I agree that the ruling of the Supreme Court was clear. That is important. It provides welcome clarity in a range of areas. And where it comes to the issues that he identifies, for example, around access to healthcare treatment, it is for a very good reason that we make sure that there are sex-based services available for women, for example, those who are breastfeeding, those who are going through pregnancy, and much more besides. But we also, alongside that, need to make sure that healthcare is available and accessible to all.
Jonathan Hinder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've made so much progress as a society in breaking down sexist stereotyping. The stereotypes which said women had set roles, should look and act in a certain way, they were being broken down, exposed as the fake construct they really are. Because sex is the only factor which distinguishes men from women. Beyond that, you should be able to live without conforming to those stereotypes. But then this movement came along which argued actually all those feminine, girly things, those sexist stereotypes we'd been fighting to break down, they're in fact the things which make a woman, not sex. Regressive, backward, nonsensical. So will the Secretary of State join me in saluting those courageous women who stood up and pointed out the absurdity of this argument and commit to rooting out this ideology from our public institutions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it was over many decades that feminist campaigners from the 70s onwards worked incredibly hard to ensure that women were able to divorce, that when that happened they were able to see their children, that they got protection at work, that they didn't face discrimination, that they could access women's refuges, rape crisis centres, and that rape was finally, back in the early 90s, banned in marriage. I pay tribute to the amazing feminist campaigners and women over many decades who have brought us to a much stronger position, and to the brilliant trailblazers from across political parties who have ensured that we have far more women represented here now in this place than ever before.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Dignity and respect for all, those are the values that lift us up and set us free. Those are the values that define and distinguish any modern and compassionate society. I want to thank the Secretary of State for those remarks in her statement today. Will she just reiterate one more time that when this government talks about increasing, supporting equality for all, that really does mean all?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is right. This is about dignity and compassion for all, and that is an important message I think we should all take out from this House.
The final question from the backbench is David Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her clear and positive response to the Supreme Court's ruling. I, like her, before I was elected into this place, ran a North East-based homelessness charity for 8 years. And I have to say, contrary to some of the debate in the last few days, and actually even in this place today, it is almost always possible to find a solution where you can support people on a single-sex basis and those who identify as transgender. So, and I have to add, I should say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was, the last 8 years that I did that was not helped by the total lack of clarity by the government, the Conservative government that was. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that it is important to reaffirm that under the Equality Act, trans people remain protected from discrimination under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, and that the Supreme Court ruling is focused on clarifying protections that have always existed in the Equality Act based on the protected characteristic of sex?
He is right, Madam Deputy Speaker, in his assessment, and I pay tribute to the work that my honourable friend did over many years where it comes to supporting homeless young people and homeless people across the North East. I agree with him that it has always been possible to ensure that single-sex spaces were delivered on the basis of biological sex under the Equality Act, but I am glad that providers can now be absolutely confident and crystal clear. But one thing I would just observe in addition is that those rights were hard fought and hard won and received significant pushback over many periods of time. He will have doubtless had the same experience that I had, where commissioners would suggest that mixed-sex accommodation was appropriate. where in many cases we were talking about vulnerable young women who had been exposed to sexual violence, including sexual abuse within the home, and what they wanted and what they needed was single-sex accommodation. And it is important in that context that we ensure that services are available in an appropriate manner for anyone who needs them. And that does mean that on occasion, trans people will also require separate provision so that their needs can be properly met, their healthcare needs, their support needs, and where they may be facing abuse and intimidation.
That concludes the statement, and before we move on to the next statement, I'll just give a few moments for the front benches to swap over. We now come to the statement, the update on British Steel. I call Minister Sarah Jones.
With your permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a statement on the steps the Government has taken since the Steel Industry Special Measures Act came into force. On the 12th of April, the Government took the decision to recall Parliament so that we could take swift, significant action on British Steel. As honourable members will be aware, this was the first time Parliament had sat on a Saturday in over 40 years. Our attendance in this place was testament to the urgency and the importance of the issue at hand, which was to stop the immediate closure of the blast furnaces at Scunthorpe. The action we took on the 12th of April and the measures we have taken since matter greatly for this country and are of enormous importance to thousands of steelworkers and their families. I am very pleased to inform the House that this afternoon British Steel has cancelled the redundancy consultations started by Jingye. I know that many British Steel employees will be breathing a sigh of relief at that news. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is regrettable that when this government took office, we inherited a steel sector in crisis and an iconic British company facing an existential threat. Since day one, we have worked tirelessly with British Steel and the trade unions to find a resolution, because blast furnace closures at Scunthorpe is an outcome this government was simply not willing to allow. To that end, I want to stress that this kind of state intervention is not one we intend to replicate in other situations or other industries. We recognise that unprecedented action was warranted for what was a truly unprecedented situation. As honourable members will know, the legislation we introduced, and which was passed that weekend, gave us the power to direct British Steel's board and workforce, ensure they get paid, and order the raw materials to keep the blast furnaces running. It also permits the government to do these things itself if the circumstances demand it. We have wasted no time in enacting these powers and taking the urgent action required to keep the blast furnaces lit at Scunthorpe. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have secured the raw materials needed to keep the blast furnaces operating, and we continue to work at pace to secure a steady pipeline of materials. Officials were on site to help British Steel within hours of the Steel Industry Act becoming law, and we are already seeing the real-world impact of our decisive intervention. I am delighted to say that British Steel has also confirmed today that they can keep operating both of the UK's last remaining blast furnaces, in contrast to Jingye's plans to shut one of them down earlier this month. It will come as no surprise to honourable members that the company's workforce, their families, their suppliers and communities have expressed deep gratitude for the action we have taken, which has preserved steelmaking at Scunthorpe and safeguarded thousands of skilled steel jobs. But now the immediate emergency has passed. It is right that honourable members also ask questions about what is next. We have been clear that to secure the long-term future of British Steel, which has not been properly invested in for years, we will need a modernisation programme, ideally with a private sector partner. Furthermore, we will need to look beyond any individual company and ensure a secure and thriving future for the whole steel sector. That's why we are continuing our work to publish the steel strategy this spring. All options are on the table as we begin to address the company's long-term sustainable future. My officials met with Jingye on the 16th of April.